She stood alone in her white wedding dress in the flower-filled hallway. Everything was ready, except the groom. When the grand doors opened, it wasn't him who walked in. It was her sister, wearing the same wedding dress, hand in hand with the man she loved. No explanation, no apology, only a cold stare and the words, "Get out of here." Her parents stood behind them, silent. That was the moment Evelyn Hartwell understood the truth. She had never belonged to this family. Like and comment the city you're viewing from, so I know how far this story has come. Don't leave, because what happens next will change everything. The flowers had been Evelyn's idea. 3,000 white peonies imported from a grower 2 states over, strung from the ceiling of the Harrington Hall ballroom in cascading curtains that caught the morning light and turned it into something soft and golden. She had spent 4 months coordinating with the florist, had driven out to inspect the first sample arrangement herself, had stood in the empty ballroom on a Tuesday afternoon in February, and felt, for the first time in a long time, like her life was heading somewhere that made sense. That was 6 months ago. Now it was the morning of her wedding, and the flowers looked like they were suffocating her. Evelyn stood in the bridal suite on the 2nd floor of Harrington Hall, staring at herself in a full-length mirror that was framed in Baroque gold leaf. The dress was ivory silk, cut close at the waist, with a neckline modest enough that her mother had approved it without comment. Her dark hair had been pinned up by a woman named Rosa, who had done this for 30 years and moved through the task with the quiet efficiency of someone assembling furniture. There were pearls at her ears. There was foundation on her face. From the outside, she looked composed and ready, and like exactly the kind of bride people photographed for magazine spreads. Inside her chest, something was pulling at a loose thread. She couldn't name it. She had tried. In the weeks leading up to this morning, she had cataloged the anxiety, had taken it apart piece by piece the way she did with her second graders when they couldn't explain why they were crying. What exactly are you feeling? Where exactly does it hurt? And she had always come up empty. Daniel was a good man. He was stable and handsome and worked in commercial real estate and called her every evening at 8. Her mother adored him. Her father had given the engagement his full endorsement over a dinner that lasted 3 hours and ended with 2 bottles of wine and a handshake that Evelyn was not invited to be part of. She had told herself the thread-pulling feeling was just nerves. Now, with 40 minutes until the ceremony, she was less certain. "You look beautiful," said Rosa, setting down a can of hairspray and stepping back to examine her work. "Thank you," Evelyn said. Her voice came out level, which surprised her. Rosa left. The suite went quiet except for the distant sound of a string quartet running warm-up scales somewhere below. Evelyn turned away from the mirror and walked to the window. The parking lot below was already filling up. She could see guests in formal wear moving toward the main entrance, women in heels picking their way carefully across the paved surface, men straightening jackets. 300 people. Her mother had insisted on 300 people. Evelyn had suggested something smaller, something intimate, and her mother had looked at her with the particular expression she kept for suggestions she found embarrassing. Evelyn's phone buzzed on the vanity table. She almost ignored it. Then she crossed the room and picked it up and looked at the screen. It was a text from a number she didn't recognize. 6 words. "Don't go downstairs, I'm sorry." She read it twice, then a third time. The string quartet below was playing something that she couldn't identify, something slow and repetitive, and the sound of it filled the suite and made the 6 words on her screen feel much heavier than they should have. She was still staring at the phone when the door opened. It wasn't her mother, and it wasn't Rosa, and it wasn't any of the 3 bridesmaids who had gotten dressed in the suite next door and then gone down 20 minutes ago when Evelyn said she needed a few minutes alone. It was her father. Richard Hartwell was 61 years old and had the bearing of a man who had spent his entire adult life making sure other people understood that he was important. He was tall and silver-haired and wore a dark suit that had been tailored to him specifically. And he walked into the room with the measured deliberation of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. Behind him was her mother, Margaret. Then, half a step behind Margaret, came someone else, Camilla. Evelyn's older sister was 30 years old and had been, for as long as Evelyn could remember, the point around which the rest of the family's attention orbited. She was beautiful in the aggressive, high-maintenance way that required significant infrastructure to sustain. The blowouts, the facials, The clothing allowance that had never formally ended, despite the fact that Camilla had a job and an apartment and was supposedly a functional adult. She was wearing a dress that Evelyn didn't recognize. It was white. Not cream. Not champagne. White. It took Evelyn 3 full seconds to understand what she was looking at. The dress was hers, the ivory silk, the fitted waist, the modest neckline that her mother had approved without comment. It had been hanging in the suite's closet 40 minutes ago, and now it was on Camilla's body, and Camilla was standing in the doorway of the bridal suite with her hair done and her makeup done, and a look on her face that was something between defiance and desperation. Evelyn's phone was still in her hand. "What?" she said. That was all she could manage. The word came out flat and empty, like a door closing on an empty room. Her father took a step forward. "Evelyn, we need you to listen carefully. That's my dress. I know, and I need you to... Where is Daniel?" The silence that followed that question lasted long enough that she already knew the answer before anyone spoke. She could hear it in the way her mother looked at the floor. She could see it in the set of Camilla's jaw, that particular tension that appeared whenever Camilla had done something she wasn't going to apologize for. "Daniel and Camilla," her father said, with the careful diction of a man reading from a prepared statement, "have developed feelings for each other. This happened recently, and neither of them planned it, and I understand that this is..." "Stop." He stopped. The string quartet downstairs had moved on to something else now, something brighter and more rhythmic, and the distance between that sound and what was happening in this room was so enormous that Evelyn felt momentarily untethered from her own body, like she was watching this scene from somewhere near the ceiling, observing the woman in the sophisticated updo and the pearl earrings receive information that was going to take a long time to fully arrive. "He's downstairs," she said. "Yes." "With her." No one answered that. "You brought her up here wearing my dress," Evelyn said. She was looking at her father now, not at Camilla, because if she looked at Camilla, she was going to do something that she would have to carry with her for a long time afterward. "You brought her up here wearing my dress to tell me that my fiancé is downstairs with her, and you need me to... What? What exactly are you asking me to do?" Richard Hartwell's jaw worked briefly before he found his footing again. "We're asking you to be reasonable. There are 300 people downstairs the catering has been paid for. The venue is... You want the wedding to happen. We want to avoid a scene." The word scene landed with the particular weight it always carried in this family, that outsized terror of public embarrassment that had governed every significant decision Evelyn could remember her parents making, that had been the invisible hand behind every correction and every silence and every moment when she had needed something and been told instead to be quiet and not make things difficult. "You want Camilla to marry Daniel?" she said slowly, working through the logic of it the way she worked through word problems with her students. "At my wedding, in my dress, today, and you want me to go home. We want you to understand that this is a difficult situation for the entire family. Get out. Evelyn, get out of this room." Her voice had dropped to something very quiet and very steady, which was worse than shouting would have been, and she could see her father register this. "All 3 of you, get out right now." Her mother finally spoke. Margaret Hartwell had the kind of voice that had always carried authority through modulation rather than volume, the quiet certainty of a woman who had spent decades being obeyed. "This is not something we decided lightly. Your sister, don't, has been struggling, and Daniel, I said don't, provides a stability that..." "Mother," Evelyn looked at her directly for the first time since they'd walked in. "If you finish that sentence, I will walk downstairs and tell every single person in that ballroom exactly what happened in this room. Every single person, including the Merritt family, including Daniel's parents, including whoever from the Westfield account your firm has been trying to impress for the past 8 months." The room went very still. Margaret closed her mouth. Evelyn became aware of her own heartbeat. It was loud and steady and slightly too fast, like a metronome set at the wrong tempo. She noticed that her hands were not shaking, which seemed strange. They should have been shaking. She was observing herself from a clinical distance, watching the woman she was in this moment with something close to detachment, and what she noticed was that beneath the shock, Beneath the nauseating wave of betrayal still moving through her chest, there was something else beginning to form. Not grief. Not yet. Something colder and sharper. Camilla finally moved. She stepped around their parents and came further into the room, and she had the grace, at least, to look like she knew she was standing somewhere she had no right to stand. Evie, don't call me that. I didn't plan this. I want you to know that. I didn't plan any of it. You're wearing my wedding dress. Camilla's chin came up slightly, that old defensive gesture, the one she'd used since childhood, whenever she'd been caught doing something she knew was wrong and had already committed to not backing down from. The dress doesn't change what Daniel and I— You should stop talking, Evelyn said. Genuinely, you should stop talking right now, because you are about to tell me something you've convinced yourself is a love story, and I'm going to have to listen to it while wearing these earrings, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to stand here and absorb whatever story you've told yourself to make this feel acceptable. Camilla's composure flickered, just briefly. Evelyn had spent 27 years learning how to read her sister's face, and she saw the flicker, the thing behind the defiance that Camilla would never call guilt, because calling it guilt would require acknowledging the full shape of what she'd done. I'm asking you, Richard Hartwell said from the doorway, to think about this family. Evelyn picked up her phone from the vanity table. She picked up the small ivory clutch that Rosa had set out beside it. She looked around the bridal suite one more time. At the peonies someone had arranged in a crystal vase near the window. At the empty hanger in the open closet. At the half glass of water she'd been sipping when the door had opened and the morning had ended. I am, she said. I'm thinking about it very clearly. She walked past her father. She walked past her mother. She walked past Camilla, close enough to smell the perfume that Camilla had borrowed from her 3 years ago and never returned. She went out into the corridor and turned toward the service stairs at the far end, away from the ballroom, away from the sound of the string quartet and the 300 people who were waiting and had no idea. She did not look back. The service stairs smelled like industrial cleaner and old carpet, and Evelyn went down them in her ivory heels with one hand on the metal railing, taking the steps carefully because the last thing she was going to do was fall. On the ground floor, she found a fire exit and pushed through it into an alleyway behind the venue, where 2 men in catering uniforms were smoking near a dumpster and looked at her with the startled expressions of people who have never seen a full wedding ensemble emerge from a fire door at 7:40 in the morning. She walked past them without speaking. The alleyway fed into a side street. She followed it to the main road. The early morning air had a cold edge to it that the October forecast hadn't fully captured, and it hit her face and the bare skin of her arms and collarbone, and she stood on the sidewalk outside Harrington Hall, listening to the city make its ordinary Saturday morning sounds. A truck downshifting on the avenue, a dog somewhere, the distant percussion of a construction site that apparently did not observe weekends. And she had the overwhelming, absurd sensation that the world had not received the news yet, that it was still operating under the assumption that this was a normal morning, that someone was supposed to correct it. She had $300 in the ivory clutch. Her phone, her keys were upstairs in the suite. She started walking. She didn't have a destination, not exactly. The apartment she'd shared with Daniel for 11 months was not a place she could go. Her parents' house was not a place she could go. She had friends, good ones, but calling any of them at this hour to explain what had just happened required more clarity than she currently possessed, required the ability to put the shape of it into sentences, and she was not there yet. So she walked. The dress drew looks. A woman in a wedding gown on a city sidewalk at 7 in the morning was not an invisible thing, but she kept her eyes forward and her pace steady, and she made herself breathe at the rhythm she used during the worst moments of difficult parent-teacher conferences, the long, slow in and out that her therapist had given her 3 years ago, and that she had used more times than she wanted to count. 40 minutes later, she was 17 blocks from Harrington Hall, and her feet were beginning to protest the heels on the uneven sidewalk, and she had not yet cried, which she was aware of in the same way you're aware of a weather system building on the horizon. Not here yet, but coming, and going to be significant when it arrived. She turned a corner and nearly walked into a man. He was tall, 6'2", maybe taller, and wearing a dark overcoat over what appeared to be a suit that had cost more than her monthly rent. He had dark hair cut close and a face that had been put together by someone working in sharp angles, a jaw that suggested stubbornness, eyes that were either dark gray or dark brown in the pre-dawn streetlight, and a mouth set in the particular configuration of a person who has spent so much of his life being cautious that the expression had become a permanent feature. He was standing on the sidewalk outside a building with a steel door and no signage, and he had a phone pressed to his ear, and he was speaking in a low, controlled voice that stopped the moment she nearly collided with him. He caught her by the arm. Not roughly, it was reflexive, the automatic reach of someone with good instincts, but firm enough that she registered the grip. They looked at each other. Evelyn had the fleeting, disconnected thought that he looked like someone who had also had a very bad morning. "I'll call you back," he said into the phone. He lowered it from his ear without waiting for a response and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not quite surprise, not quite calculation, something that moved through both and settled into something else. "Are you all right?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said, because she was done lying about things for the day. Something in his expression shifted. He glanced at the dress, a brief assessing look like he was cataloging information, and then back at her face. "Do you need somewhere to go?" "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You don't." He said it without apparent discomfort. Most people would have backed away from the directness of that, would have filled the space with reassurances or justifications, or the performative helpfulness of strangers who want to feel useful without actually taking on any risk. He just stood there, in his expensive overcoat, on the empty sidewalk and waited, like he had time, like the answer she gave him was going to be the same quality whether it came in 10 seconds or 10 minutes. "What's in there?" she said, nodding toward the steel door. "Currently, 4 of my lawyers and a man who is trying to take everything I own." She looked at the door. She looked back at him. "That sounds terrible." "It is," he said, "though it's about to get worse." Something about the flatness of it, the absence of self-pity, the matter-of-fact delivery, cut through the white noise in her chest. She became aware of how cold she was. She became aware that her feet genuinely hurt and that she had been walking for the better part of an hour in heels and a wedding dress, and that her carefully constructed updo was starting to loosen at the left side. "I'm Adrian," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "Evelyn?" He nodded once, like this was information he was filing rather than pleasantry he was performing. Then he said, "There's a problem I need solved in the next 3 hours. It's unconventional, and it's not without risk, and I'm aware that this is not a normal thing to say to someone you've just met on a sidewalk. Nothing about this morning has been normal." "No," he agreed. "I can see that." He held her gaze when he said it, not in the invasive way, not the raking assessment she'd seen from men her whole life who thought looking at a woman carefully was the same as seeing her. He looked at her the way she sometimes looked at a problem she hadn't figured out yet, with attention that was searching for something specific. "What's the problem?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, then, "My grandfather built something over 50 years. When he died, he left it to my father, and when my father died 3 years ago, it came to me. There are people, associates, rivals, it's complicated, who have been waiting for a specific condition to be met before they can legally challenge my position. A condition in the inheritance structure that my grandfather put there because he believed in certain things." He paused. "I was supposed to be married by today. I was supposed to have been married before sunrise. The woman I was engaged to left the country 8 days ago with a man she'd been seeing for 6 months, and I did not find out until she was already gone." Evelyn absorbed this. "So you need a wife," she said. "Before dawn." She looked up the street and then down it. The sky in the east was beginning to show the first gray-pink edge of coming light. She looked down at the dress she was wearing. "This is a real proposal," she said. "It's a contract," he said carefully. "Legal marriage on record. In exchange, you'd have access to significant financial resources, protection, and when you choose to end it, a settlement that would let you build whatever life you want, wherever you want it. I'm not asking you to love me. I'm asking you to sign paperwork and stand in a room with a judge. Who are the people trying to take what you built? Men who think that what belongs to my family should belong to them. And marrying someone stops them. It closes the window they've been waiting for, legally, permanently. She thought about Daniel standing at the altar in the ballroom behind her. She thought about her father's prepared statement, and her mother's carefully modulated voice, and Camilla in the ivory silk. She thought about the text message she'd received from the unknown number. "Don't go downstairs. I'm sorry." And she realized she'd never figured out who sent it, and that it probably didn't matter, and that the next chapter of her life was not going to be written inside the Harrington Hall bridal suite. She looked at Adrian Voss and said, "Tell me the rest of it. Tell me what I'm actually walking into, not the version that makes it easier to agree to." He held her gaze for a long beat. Then he said, "Walk inside with me." She did. The room beyond the steel door was not what she expected. It was large and quietly lit, with exposed brick and a long table that held the remains of what appeared to have been a working night. Laptops, paper, multiple coffee cups at varying stages of emptiness. The four lawyers looked up when she entered, and two of them immediately began whispering to each other, and a fifth man she hadn't noticed stood up from a chair near the far wall. He was older, heavy-set, with the look of someone who had been awake for a very long time. "This is Victor," Adrian said. "He's been with my family for 22 years. He'll explain the legal structure." Victor looked at Evelyn with the careful, measuring expression of a man who had seen a great many unusual things over 2 decades of service and had learned to evaluate each new one with precision rather than judgment. He glanced briefly at the wedding dress. He did not comment on it. "The inheritance clause," Victor said, pulling a chair from the table and setting it in front of Evelyn with the automatic courtesy of someone whose manners ran bone deep, "requires that the current principal of the Voss organization be lawfully married as of the effective date of the primary executor's death. That date is today. Specifically, the clause expires at 6:47 a.m., which is when the will entered its 36th month of administration." "What time is it now?" Evelyn said. 4:12. "And what happens at 6:47 if the clause isn't met?" Victor looked briefly at Adrian. Adrian gave a small nod. "Control of the primary assets passes to a joint claim held by 2 men, associates of the previous administration, who inserted themselves into the succession structure during a period when Mr. Voss was abroad and the estate was being managed by interim counsel. They've been waiting for this window for 3 years. Can it be contested? It can. It would take 4 to 6 years in court and cost approximately everything the organization currently holds in liquid assets. In practical terms, no." Evelyn turned to look at Adrian, who was standing near the table with his hands in his overcoat pockets, watching her work through this. "You're not lying to me," she said. It was not quite a question. "No? How do I know that?" "Well, you don't yet," he said, "but I don't have the time or the interest to construct an elaborate deception this morning. I need a solution. You appear to need a destination. I'm telling you exactly what this is." She stood up and walked to the long table and looked at the papers spread across it without touching them. She could see her own name in her head, Evelyn Hartwell, elementary school teacher, 37 months into a relationship that had ended this morning in a series of images she wasn't ready to fully develop yet. The dress on the wrong body, the silence from her parents, the prepared statement from her father. Think about this family. She thought about her family. She thought about what she owed them and what they had spent her entire life telling her she owed them, and whether those 2 things were actually the same. "I need 2 things," she said. Adrian looked at her. "I need the terms of the settlement in writing before I sign anything else. Clear, specific, and legally binding." She held up a second finger. "And I need to know that when the window closes and this is done, I'm not going to have people following me home." "The first I can have in 40 minutes, he said. "The second—" He paused. "No one in my world will touch you. That I can guarantee." "You can guarantee it." "Yes." She looked at him for a long time. He stood still under the assessment without flinching, without reassuring her, without filling the silence with anything unnecessary. "All right," she said. The room changed slightly when she said it. The lawyers resumed their low-voiced conversation. Victor moved toward a desk in the corner, and Adrian looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, something that landed somewhere between gratitude and something more complicated that he closed down before she could examine it. "We need to move quickly," he said. "There's a judge. He's been waiting." "You had a judge standing by." I was working through options. That's either very prepared or very arrogant. Probably both, he said, and for just a moment the corner of his mouth moved in something that wasn't quite a smile but was adjacent to one, and she filed that away, the fact that it was there, brief and involuntary, because people showed you who they were in small, unguarded moments, and she had learned, belatedly, to pay attention. The judge was a compact woman in her 60s named Aldridge, who was waiting in a smaller room off the main space, sitting with a cup of coffee and the calm patience of someone being paid well to wait. She looked at Evelyn, at the wedding dress, the pearl earrings, the loosening updo, and said nothing about any of it, which Evelyn appreciated more than she could have articulated. The paperwork took 23 minutes. Victor had drafted a settlement agreement that was 4 pages long and very specific, and Evelyn read every word of it twice, while 2 of the lawyers watched her do so with expressions that suggested they were not accustomed to people in her position reading documents carefully. She had 3 questions. Adrian answered 2 of them directly and directed Victor to adjust the language on the 3rd. She signed where indicated. Adrian signed opposite her. Judge Aldridge performed the ceremony in 7 minutes flat. There were no flowers. There was no music. There were no 300 people in formal wear. There was a fluorescent light overhead and a table covered in legal documents and a man she had met 40 minutes ago standing close enough that she could see the tension held in the line of his jaw. And when Aldridge said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the words fell into the room and settled there, and Evelyn felt the strangest sensation, not grief, not triumph, not fear, but something much quieter, like a door she hadn't known existed had just swung open in the wall of her life. The time was 5:49 a.m. They were legally married. Evelyn stood in the room as the lawyers gathered their papers, and Aldridge packed up her case, and Victor made a quiet phone call in the corner, and she thought about the moment she'd walked out of Harrington Hall, the cold air, the construction sounds, the ordinary Saturday morning that hadn't known yet what it was carrying. She looked at Adrian, who was standing a few feet away reading something on his phone with a focused, still expression, the tension in his jaw finally easing slightly. He looked up and caught her watching him. "The assets are secured," he said. "The claim is void." "Good," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Not long, but long enough. And she had the unnerving, unwanted sense that he was seeing something he hadn't expected to see, not the dress or the ruined wedding morning or the practical efficiency with which she'd navigated the last hour. Something else. Something he hadn't put in the contract. "You'll come to the residence," he said. "Victor will explain the arrangements. You don't have to appear in public yet, and I won't—" He stopped, started again. "This is not what you expected today to be." "No," she agreed. "It isn't. I'm aware of what you gave up to make this work." She almost told him he was wrong, that she hadn't given anything up, that what she'd left behind at Harrington Hall was already a burning building when she walked out. But she didn't say it, because saying it required unpacking more of the morning than she had the bandwidth to carry right now. "Let's go," she said instead. Victor led them to a car waiting in the alley, a black vehicle, long, anonymous-looking in the way that expensive things sometimes tried to look like less than they were. As they moved through the pre-dawn streets toward whatever came next, Evelyn watched the city slide past the window and let herself for just one moment feel the weight of the morning, the flowers, the dress, her father's prepared voice, Camilla's chin coming up in that old defensive way. Then she let it move through her and settle somewhere she could return to later when she had the room for it. She was married to a man whose last name she'd learned from a legal document 40 minutes ago. She was sitting in his car, heading toward a part of her life that had no map. And somewhere across the city, in a ballroom full of peonies and 300 people in formal wear, a wedding was either continuing without her or falling apart in the specific, spectacular way that events built on betrayal tended to fall apart. She found, to her own surprise, that she could breathe. The car slowed as they reached an intersection, and Adrian's phone buzzed once. He glanced at it, and whatever he saw made the tension come back into his jaw, different from before, harder. He typed a brief response and then lowered the phone to his knee and stared at it for a moment with an expression she couldn't read. "Problem," she said. It wasn't a question. He was quiet for a beat too long. "Adrian." He looked up at her then, And in the gray early light of the car, she saw something in his face that hadn't been there an hour ago in the back room with the lawyers. Something that looked like the beginning of a reckoning. "There's something I need to tell you," he said carefully, "about your family." The car moved through the intersection. The city kept going around them, and Evelyn Hartwell, now legally Evelyn Voss, looked at the man she'd married 2 hours after her groom chose her sister, and felt the first cold finger of a truth she wasn't ready for yet, moving through her chest like a blade beginning to find its angle. "Tell me," she said. He opened his mouth. And outside, the first full light of morning broke over the city like something that had been waiting a very long time to arrive. He didn't finish the sentence. That was the thing she would come back to later, in the weeks when she was trying to reconstruct the exact sequence of how everything unraveled. Not what he said, but the fact that he stopped himself before he said it. Adrian Voss, who had spent the pre-dawn hours of that morning dismantling a legal challenge to his entire inheritance with the precision of a man who did not permit himself the luxury of hesitation, had opened his mouth in the back seat of that car and then closed it again. And the look that moved across his face in the gray morning light was the look of a man recalculating something fundamental. "Tell me," she said again. "Not here." He put the phone in his inside pocket and looked out the window, his jaw back to that held quality she was already beginning to recognize as his default against unwanted emotion. "When we get to the residence." You brought it up." "I know." "Then you don't get to table it." He looked at her. The directness of it, the simple refusal to be managed, seemed to catch him slightly off guard, though he recovered quickly. "I brought it up at the wrong moment. Give me 20 minutes. She held his gaze for another beat, then let it go. Not because she was dropping it, because she was learning the man, and learning him required patience she would apply strategically, and this was not the hill. The car moved through streets that were just beginning to fill with early morning traffic. She watched the city out the window and counted her breaths and listened to the sound of Victor on the phone in the front seat, speaking in a low, rapid voice in what she thought might be a mix of English and something Eastern European, relaying information she couldn't fully parse, but whose tone was clearly that of a situation being managed on multiple fronts simultaneously. The residence was not what she had pictured. She'd had 30 seconds to form an expectation, something fortress-like, something that announced its own significance. And what the car pulled up to instead was a building on a quiet street in a part of the city she knew only as the kind of neighborhood where the architecture was old enough to have earned the right to be understated. 6 stories of gray stone, wide windows, a door that looked like wood but had the subtle heft of something reinforced. No gate, no visible security. Just a man in a charcoal jacket standing near the entrance who straightened slightly when the car stopped and opened the door before Victor had finished putting it in park. Inside was different. Not ostentatious, but dense with the accumulated weight of a family that had been somewhere for a very long time. Dark wood floors, high ceilings, bookshelves that held actual books, with the creased spines of things that had been read rather than displayed. There was a painting on the main hallway wall that Evelyn did not know enough about art to evaluate, but recognized instinctively as significant. The whole place had the temperature and smell of somewhere that had been kept carefully against the outside world for decades. A woman named Irene, who appeared to be in her late 50s and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone whose competence had never been questioned, met them in the entrance hall and led Evelyn upstairs without ceremony, showing her a suite of rooms, bedroom, bathroom, a small sitting room with a window that looked over a private garden, and telling her with matter-of-fact efficiency that clothing would be arranged within the hour and that she was to consider the residence her home for as long as she needed it. Evelyn stood in the center of the bedroom and looked at the painting on the opposite wall. A winter landscape, stark, leafless trees, and a field of pale gray, and felt the silence of the room settle around her. Somewhere below she could hear voices, Adrian's voice among them. She sat down on the edge of the bed, still in the wedding dress, and took out her phone. 14 missed calls. 6 from a number she didn't recognize, 4 from her mother, 3 from her best friend Nora, the last one time-stamped 40 minutes ago with a text that read, "Evelyn, what the hell is happening? Camilla just walked down the aisle. Call me." She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she put the phone face down on the nightstand and took off the pearl earrings and set them beside it, and she sat in the quiet of the winter landscape room and let the morning finish arriving in her chest. All of it, the full weight of it, and it was bad. It was genuinely bad, the kind of hurt that sits in the sternum and radiates outward and doesn't have a clean shape. But it was also, she noticed, manageable. She was still here. She was still thinking. She had not done anything she was going to regret. That was something. She changed out of the dress herself, using the clothing she found in the bathroom. A robe, oversized, clearly not hers but clean, and she hung the wedding dress carefully on the back of the closet door because it was an $800 garment and she had paid for it herself, and she was not going to leave it crumpled on the floor of a stranger's room, regardless of what it represented. Then she went downstairs. Adrian was in a room off the main hallway that appeared to function as a study or a war room or both. Wide desk, multiple screens, 3 men she hadn't seen before arranged around the space in attitudes of tense consultation. He was standing with his back to the door when she entered, looking at something on the central screen, and he turned when he heard her come in, and the 3 other men looked at her with the collective expression of people who had been briefed on the morning's events, but were still processing the reality of a woman in a bathrobe standing in the threshold of their operations room. "Give us the room," Adrian said. The 3 men moved without argument. Victor, who had been in the corner, caught Evelyn's eye briefly as he passed. An evaluating look, not unfriendly, the look of a man updating a file. And then the door closed and she and Adrian were alone with the screens and the desk and the residue of whatever crisis had been in progress before she walked in. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He looked at her for a moment, then he pulled the chair from behind the desk, placed it in the center of the room facing her, and sat down in it himself, which she hadn't expected. He was putting himself at her eye level, giving up the architectural advantage of the desk. She registered this. "Your father," he said, "Richard Hartwell." "What about him?" "He and my father did business together, 23 years ago." He said it cleanly, no preamble, watching her face. "Your father was managing the financial structuring for a development consortium. My father, Mafia Boss, was one of 3 principal investors. There was a deal, a significant one, a property acquisition in the Port District that would have tripled the value of everything my father had put into the consortium." "What happened?" "Your father pulled out 24 hours before the deal closed. He took 2 other investors with him. The acquisition collapsed. The consortium dissolved." He stopped. "My father lost everything he'd put in. Not just the money, the deal had been leveraged. He lost the collateral he'd offered. 3 buildings, a warehouse complex, and the liquid capital he'd spent 12 years accumulating." Evelyn stood very still. "My father never recovered from that financially," Adrian continued. "He rebuilt, but it took years. And he wasn't the same man after it. He died 3 years ago with a fraction of what he should have had. And the people who've been trying to claim my inheritance, their position exists in part because those original losses weakened our standing, because the Voss family entered a period of reduced influence that left openings in the succession structure that shouldn't have existed. The room held the information between them like a third presence. "You didn't know who I was," Evelyn said. "When you found me." "No." "When did you find out?" "In the car. Victor ran your name through the legal filing." "The marriage filing?" "Yes." She walked to the window. Outside, the private garden was gray and still in the morning light, a few dead-headed roses on a trellis near the far wall, a stone bench that nobody appeared to use. She looked at it and thought about her father's face in the bridal suite, the practiced stillness, the prepared statement, the years of family dinners where she had felt like a figure placed carefully at the table, rather than a person who actually belonged there. "You think he did it deliberately," she said. "Your father losing everything." "I know he did. I have the documentation. I've had it for 8 months. A pause. "I wasn't looking for a way to use it. I was looking for the full picture. I wanted to understand what actually happened before I decided what it meant." She turned from the window. "But you hadn't decided yet." "No. And then I showed up on your sidewalk." He held her gaze. "Yes. The thing about it, the thing she was working through as she stood in her borrowed robe in this stranger's house on what was supposed to have been her wedding day, was the geometry of the coincidence. Not whether it was real. It clearly was, The universe had the habit of brutal irony that anyone paying attention could confirm. The question was what it did to the architecture of the morning, whether it changed the contract she'd signed in a room with the judge at 5:49 a.m., whether it was supposed to. "Does it change anything?" she said. "For you." He was quiet for a beat that lasted too long to be comfortable. "I don't know yet." "That's honest." "I try to be." "My father," she said carefully, "has spent my entire life making decisions about what I was owed and what I wasn't. He decided this morning that what I was owed was silence while my sister wore my dress and married my fiancé in a ballroom full of people I'd invited." She kept her voice level. "I'm telling you that so you understand I'm not defending him. I have no interest in defending him. Whatever he did to your family, that's on him. That's not something I carry." "I know that." "Do you?" He stood up from the chair. He was taller than she remembered, or the room was smaller than she'd registered, or the morning had compressed something about her sense of scale. He stood up and he looked at her, and she saw him working through something, saw the calculation happening in real time behind those gray dark eyes. "I'm not going to use you," he said, "if that's what you're asking." "It's not what I'm asking. I'm asking whether you're going to look at me differently now that you know whose daughter I am." He was quiet. She waited. "Probably," he said, "for a while. And then it'll depend on who you actually are." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to her in longer than she wanted to count, and she felt it land somewhere in her chest with a small, sharp weight. "All right," she said, "then that's where we are." He nodded once. "I need breakfast," she said, "and I need to make one phone call, and then I need you to tell me what the next 48 hours looks like." For the second time that morning, the corner of his mouth moved. "Irene will handle breakfast," he said. "Take your call. I'll be here." She went back upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed and picked up her phone and called Nora. Nora Castellan had been Evelyn's closest friend since the third year of college, and her primary quality, the one that had sustained the friendship through a decade of difficult seasons, was that she processed shock faster than anyone Evelyn had ever met. She didn't gasp. She didn't insert herself. She listened until the information had fully arrived, and then she said whatever was actually true. Evelyn told her. All of it. The suite, the dress, her father's prepared statement, the fire exit, the sidewalk, Adrian, the contract, the judge. She talked for 11 minutes without stopping, and Nora listened without interrupting, and when Evelyn finished, the line was silent for a long count of 5. "Okay," Nora said. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Do you want to leave?" "No." "Do you need me to come?" Evelyn looked at the winter landscape painting on the opposite wall. The bare trees, the pale gray field. "Not yet. I'll call you when I do." "Evelyn?" "Yeah." "Camilla wore your dress, your parents watched, and you're in a stranger's house married to a man you met 2 hours ago." A pause. "I just want you to know that if the last part turns out badly, I will personally dismantle everything your family has built, one piece at a time. Despite everything, despite the sternum ache and the fatigue beginning to accumulate at the edges of her eyes, and the knowledge that somewhere across the city a wedding reception was either in full swing or in pieces, Evelyn almost smiled. "I know," she said. "I love you. Go eat something." She went back downstairs. The next 3 days had a quality of unreality that Evelyn navigated by keeping herself in motion. Irene brought clothing, understated, well-made, correctly sized, which meant someone had looked at her carefully enough to estimate a size without asking, and she filed this as information about how this household operated. She ate breakfast with Adrian on the first morning in a kitchen that smelled like coffee and old wood, and they talked about logistics with the practical brevity of 2 people who had agreed to share a space and were determining the terms of that sharing. He told her what he needed in terms of appearance, 2 public events in the next 2 weeks, where she would be present as his wife, a meeting with the legal team to establish the official record, and an interview with a man named Hargrove, who served as the organization's primary point of contact with the financial institutions they worked with. She told him what she needed: clarity about what she was and wasn't expected to know, access to a vehicle and a schedule that didn't require her to account for her time hourly, and honesty, complete unconditional honesty, about anything that touched her directly. He agreed to all three without negotiation, which surprised her. The first public appearance was a dinner at a private club on the fourth floor of a building in the financial district. Evelyn wore a dress that Irene had arranged, deep navy, impeccably cut, and sat across from a man named Beaumont who controlled a substantial portion of the Port District's commercial real estate and whose smile had the texture of something maintained through significant effort. Beaumont's wife was beside him, a woman named Sylvia, who was in her late 40s and had the eyes of someone paying much closer attention to her surroundings than her expression suggested. Evelyn talked to Sylvia for 20 minutes about education policy, while Beaumont and Adrian conducted their adjacent conversation in the clipped referential shorthand of men who had been doing business together long enough to have developed their own dialect. She was aware of being assessed, both by Beaumont, whose evaluation was straightforward and commercial, and by Sylvia, whose evaluation was something else. More complex, more patient. When they left the dinner, in the car, Adrian said, Sylvia Beaumont spent the first 5 years of her marriage running intelligence for her husband's operation. I know, Evelyn said. He looked at her, the way she positioned herself at the table, the order she asked her questions. She wasn't making conversation, she was building a map. Evelyn looked out the window. I used to have a student who did the same thing. Seemed like he was drawing in class when he was actually listening to everything. Adrian was quiet for a moment, then, what did she conclude about you? I don't know yet, but she took my number. He didn't say anything, but she felt the quality of his attention shift in the dark of the car, something that wasn't quite reassessment but was adjacent to it, and she let it be what it was. On the 6th day, her mother called. Evelyn was in the sitting room off her suite, reading through a briefing document Victor had given her, a general outline of the organization's legitimate holdings, the kind of overview one gives a new partner who needs to understand the shape of a thing without yet knowing all its corners. And her phone lit up with her mother's number, and she looked at it for 3 full rings before answering. Evelyn? Her mother's voice was modulated as always, but there was something underneath the modulation now, a hairline fracture in the control. We've been trying to reach you. I know. Where are you? Safe. That's not an answer. It's the only one I'm giving. A pause. In the background, she could hear the familiar ambient sounds of her childhood home, the particular resonance of the high-ceilinged kitchen, something that might have been the television. Your father wants to speak with you, her mother said. Then he can call me himself. Evelyn, mother. She set down the briefing document. I want you to think very carefully about what you say next, because this is the last conversation we have on your terms. Everything after this is on mine. The silence that followed was longer than any silence her mother had offered her in 30 years. Camilla, her mother began, is not what I want to discuss. She's not. The marriage, it's already. There are problems, Evelyn. Daniel is. Another pause. He's not what we thought he was. Evelyn looked at the winter landscape painting on her wall. She had moved it from the bedroom to the sitting room because she found she wanted to look at it while she worked. The bare trees, the pale field. She had started to think of it as honest, which was not how she normally thought about art. I'm sorry to hear that, she said. And she was, in a way that had nothing to do with Daniel and everything to do with the fact that her sister was going to have to live inside the wreckage of the choice she'd made. She needs you, her mother said. The words hit a specific spot, the spot that had been trained for 27 years to respond to exactly this kind of appeal, the soft-voiced invocation of family need, the implication that Evelyn's particular brand of steadiness was a resource to be drawn on, rather than a quality she had built herself through considerable effort. No, Evelyn said. She doesn't need me. She needs to deal with what she did. Evelyn, I'm going to hang up now. When you want to talk about what happened, what actually happened, not what you'd prefer to have happened, you can call me and I'll decide whether to answer. She ended the call. Her hands, she noticed, were very steady. On the 8th day, Victor came to find her. He knocked on the sitting room door with 2 knocks, precise, unhurried, and when she said, "Come in," he entered and closed the door behind him and stood with his hands behind his back. In the posture she was beginning to recognize as his mode for delivering information he considered important. "There's a situation," he said. "What kind?" "The two men who held the claim against Mr. Voss's inheritance, Reinhold and Casper. They've accepted the legal closure of the window, publicly. Their lawyers sent acknowledgement 2 days ago." He paused. "But we have reason to believe they're moving on a parallel track." She waited. "They've been in contact with several of the organization's regional associates. Not the primary ones, the peripheral ones, the ones who have remained neutral over the past 3 years. They're making a case that Mr. Voss's marriage was," he chose the next word carefully, "irregular." "On what grounds?" "Speed, primarily, the timeline, and the fact that you are Richard Hartwell's daughter." The room was very quiet. "They're suggesting it was engineered," she said. "They're suggesting that Mr. Voss, knowing your father's connection to his family, deliberately sought out a Hartwell in order to—" Victor stopped. "The specific claim is that the marriage is a move in an old conflict rather than a legitimate union, that you were selected rather than found. And the associates who are listening to this, what are they looking for? Reason to realign. The peripheral associates have been waiting 3 years to see which way the Voss organization stabilizes. If there's credible doubt about the legitimacy of the marriage, several of them will move toward Reinhold." Evelyn stood up. She went to the window. The garden was unchanged, the stone bench still empty, the roses still winter bare. "Where's Adrian?" "Downstairs. He's been in the meeting for 2 hours. He asked me to brief you." "He sent you to brief me?" "Yes." "Why didn't he come himself?" Victor's expression moved through something careful. "I believe," he said, "that he is finding it difficult to look at you directly at the moment." She turned from the window. "Because of Reinhold's claim." "Because he's aware of how the claim sounds," Victor said. "And because he doesn't know yet what you'll conclude from it." She looked at Victor for a long moment. He stood still under the look with the patience of someone who had carried difficult information for a long time and had made peace with the weight of it. "Tell him I'll be down in 5 minutes," she said. Victor nodded. He moved to the door. "Victor," he stopped. "The documentation Adrian has, the proof of what my father did to his father 23 years ago." She kept her voice level. "How complete is it?" "Complete," he said. "Fully documented, dated, corroborated." "Has he decided what to do with it?" "No. He's been waiting." A pause. "I think he was waiting to see what kind of person you were." He left. She stood in the sitting room for exactly 5 minutes. She looked at the winter landscape, the bare trees, the pale gray field, the cold, honest emptiness of it. And she thought about a man she had married in a room lit by fluorescent light because both of them had run out of alternatives on the same morning. And she thought about what it meant that his enemies had found the one angle that could complicate everything. And she thought about her father, Richard Hartwell, and the prepared statement in the bridal suite, and 23 years of a feud she hadn't known she'd been born into. She went downstairs. Adrian was in the study. The other men had gone, and he was alone at the desk with 2 phones and a legal pad covered in notes and handwriting that was sharp and compressed, the handwriting of someone who wrote quickly and didn't expect anyone else to read it. He looked up when she came in, and she saw immediately what Victor had meant. There was something pulled tight in his expression, a particular strain, the look of a man confronting the possibility that something he hadn't expected to matter was beginning to matter. "I know what Victor told you," he said. "Good. I need you to understand." "Did you know," she said, "when you found me on the sidewalk? Did you know who I was before Victor ran my name?" He held her gaze. "No." "Say it plainly." I did not know you were Richard Hartwell's daughter. I did not select you. I found you on a sidewalk at 4 a.m. wearing a wedding dress, and I made a practical decision based on a crisis I was already in." His voice was even and hard-edged, and had the quality of something that had been stripped down to its essential structure. "What Victor told you is accurate. What Reinhold is telling the associates is not." "I know," she said. He stopped. "I know it wasn't engineered," she said. "I was there. I know what that morning was." She pulled the chair out from across the desk and sat down. "The problem isn't whether I believe you. The problem is whether the associates will, and whether Reinhold has anything else to use once the timing argument stops working. He watched her. The documentation, she said. What my father did to yours. If it becomes public, if it comes out as part of this, it makes the timing argument worse. Because it gives the story a shape. Star-crossed families, old betrayal, the daughter appearing at the right moment. She held his gaze. It starts to look like a plot whether it was one or not. Yes, he said. I've been thinking the same thing. So we have a problem. We have a problem. The study was quiet. Outside, she could hear the city, traffic, something distant, the ordinary percussion of a world continuing without particular reference to the thing unraveling in this room. There's something else, Adrian said. She waited. Reinhold has a source inside this house. The words arrived cleanly and settled in the room with the weight of something that had been true for a while and was only now being named. How sure are you? She said. Certain. He pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk toward her. She picked it up. It was a brief message printed, 3 lines of text describing the details of her settlement agreement, details that had been in the room with 5 people and were now, apparently, somewhere else. She set the paper back down. How long have you known? She said. 3 days. You didn't tell me. I was trying to identify who it was before You didn't tell me, she said again. Not heated, just precise, landing exactly where it needed to land. He stopped. I'm your wife, she said. Contractually, legally, in the record. And someone in this house has been feeding information about my personal financial arrangements to your enemies. And you decided to manage that information on your own without telling me. She kept her voice absolutely level. That's the kind of decision that ends things, whatever this is. That's the kind of decision that turns people who could have been allies into people who protect themselves first. He looked at her for a long, careful moment. The strain in his expression had shifted, still there, but different now, less like guilt and more like a man confronting a mirror at an angle he hadn't expected. You're right, he said. Not performatively, just factually. Who is it? She said. I have a strong suspicion. I don't have proof yet. Get proof. She stood up. And Adrian. She waited until he met her eyes. The next time there's something that touches me directly, anything, you tell me. Before you decide what to do with it, before you strategize, you tell me. He held her gaze. Agreed. She nodded once and turned to go. She was at the door when he said her name. Not Evelyn, just her name, simple, without any of the weight people usually tried to put into it when they were trying to soften something. She turned. He was still at the desk, the legal pad in front of him, the 2 phones, the evidence of a morning that had been much longer and harder than the one she'd already had. He looked at her across the width of the room, and she saw, in the lines of his face, the beginning of something that neither of them had planned for, and that both of them were now going to have to figure out what to do with. My father talked about yours, he said, for years after the deal collapsed. Not just the money. He said... He stopped, started again. He said your father looked him in the eye the morning before he pulled out and told him the deal was solid, told him his investment was safe. Evelyn stood in the doorway and felt her father's face move through her mind, the prepared statement, the modulated certainty, the lifetime of looking people in the eye and saying exactly what the moment required, regardless of what was true. Yes, she said quietly. That sounds like him. She left the room. She walked back upstairs and sat in the sitting room and looked at the winter landscape for a long time without seeing it. And she thought about 23 years and a deal in the Port District and a family that had been carrying the weight of a betrayal they hadn't known the full shape of until now. And she thought about the source inside the house, someone who had sat at the same table and passed information like currency. And she thought about Reinhold building a case out of timing and coincidence and her father's name, and she felt the whole structure of the situation shifting under her, the way ground shifts before something buried rises. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Not the same one as before. Different digits, same unlisted quality. You don't know what your husband is capable of. Get out, while the choice is still yours. She read it twice. Then she set the phone down and looked at the winter landscape, the bare trees, the pale field, the cold and honest emptiness, and understood, with the specific clarity that comes only after you've already walked through the worst thing you can imagine, that she was not going to run from this. Whatever was buried here was about to come up. She could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. Not the storm itself, not yet, but the quality of the atmosphere shifting, the specific weight of something large moving toward the surface after a long time underground. She typed back, "Who are you?" 3 minutes passed. Then, "Someone who knows what happened to the last person who trusted him completely." She stared at the screen. Her thumb hovered. Then she typed, "If you have something real to say it with your name attached. Otherwise, don't contact this number again." She put the phone face down and stood up and walked to the window and looked at the garden and breathed. Slow, deliberate, the long in and out that her body had learned for moments when the ground was uncertain. The message could be Reinhold. It could be whoever was inside the house feeding information outward. It could be someone with a genuine warning and too much fear to attach their name to it. She had no way to know yet, and she was not going to let an anonymous text in a cheap pressure tactic reorganize the map she was building. She had been reorganized by people without her consent for long enough. She went back to the desk and picked up the briefing document Victor had given her and found the page she'd been reading before her mother called, and she continued reading. An hour later, there was a knock at the door. 2 knocks, precise and unhurried. Not Victor this time. Adrian. He came in and he was holding a single sheet of paper, and his face had the look of a man who had found what he was looking for and was not glad about it. He held the paper out to her without speaking. She took it and read it. It was a printed message chain. 3 exchanges between an internal email address she recognized as belonging to one of the lawyers from the first morning and an external address she didn't recognize. The content was clinical and specific. The terms of her settlement, the timeline of the marriage, the details of the legal filing. She looked up. "Marcus?" Adrian said. He said the name like it cost him something. "He's been with the firm for 11 years. What are you going to do?" "What needs to be done?" "I'm asking you to tell me specifically." He looked at her. The strain in his face had hardened into something else now, the particular cold of a man who has been betrayed by someone inside his own walls and has finished grieving it and is now purely operational. "He'll be removed from access tonight," he said. "The legal firm will be notified. What happens after that depends on what Reinhold does with the information Marcus gave him. And if Reinhold moves on the associates before we can counter the narrative, then we move first." He held her gaze. "Together, if you're willing." The word "together" sat in the air between them, and she felt its weight, the specific gravity of a word that hadn't been in the original contract, that neither of them had put there, that had arrived on its own somewhere between the fluorescent-lit judge's room and this moment in the sitting room with the winter landscape on the wall. "I'm willing," she said. And somewhere across the city, in an office that neither of them had been to yet, Reinhold picked up his phone and made the call that would change everything. Reinhold's call lasted 4 minutes and 20 seconds. They knew this because Victor had been monitoring the line for 6 days, and the transcript was on Adrian's desk by 7 the following morning. A single page, clean and precise, the kind of document that arrives without drama and destroys everything quietly. Evelyn read it standing up, still holding the coffee cup Irene had handed her 60 seconds earlier. She read it twice. Then she set the cup down on the edge of the desk very carefully, because her hands had developed a slight tremor that she was not going to let become visible. The call was between Reinhold and a man identified in the transcript as Galloway. She didn't know that name. She looked at Adrian across the desk and said so. "Galloway runs 3 of the Eastern District Associations," Adrian said. He was already dressed, already at work, the legal pad in front of him covered in new lines of compressed handwriting. "He's been neutral for 18 months. Reinhold's been courting him since the inheritance window opened." "What did Reinhold tell him?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "Read the second paragraph." She looked back at the transcript. "The marriage is a fabrication. Voss found the Hartwell girl the same week he identified the documentation. He's been sitting on proof of what Richard Hartwell did to Mikhail for 8 months. You connect those dots yourself. He married her to neutralize the Hartwell name, make it part of his organization instead of a liability. She doesn't know she's a piece on his board. Evelyn read it twice. She put the transcript down. The room was very quiet. "This is Reinhold's version," she said. Her voice came out even, which cost her. "Yes." "But the documentation existed before I appeared on your sidewalk." "Yes." "And Galloway knows this. Galloway knows what Reinhold told him, which is strategically assembled. It's not fabricated from nothing. It uses the real facts in the sequence that produces the worst interpretation." Adrian leaned back in his chair. "Galloway isn't stupid. He'll pressure test it. But pressure testing takes time, and Reinhold is moving fast." She walked to the window. The garden again. The stone bench. The winter roses. The unchanging gray of it. She had looked at this view so many times in 8 days that it had started to feel like a fixed point, like something she could navigate by. "Is it true?" she said. Behind her, the room went very still. "Is what true?" Adrian said. She turned around. "The sequence Reinhold described. You found the documentation 8 months ago. You identified what my father did. You were already thinking about the Hartwell name as, what? A liability. A piece of unfinished business. Something that needed to be managed." She kept her eyes on his face. "And then I appeared." The silence that followed was 3 seconds long. She counted them. "The documentation came to me 8 months ago," he said. "I spent 4 months verifying it, 2 months deciding what it meant. I had no plan involving you or your family. I did not engineer a coincidence on a sidewalk at 4 in the morning. That's not what I asked." He looked at her. "I asked if you thought about the Hartwell name as something that needed to be managed. Before that morning. As an abstract problem you hadn't solved yet." The pause was shorter this time, but it was there. "Yes," he said. The word hit her somewhere below the sternum. Not because it was unexpected, she had built the question because she already suspected the answer, but because hearing it said plainly, in his flat, careful voice, gave it a weight that suspicion hadn't had. "All right," she said. "Evelyn, I'm not ending anything." She cut him off cleanly. "I'm not running. I'm establishing what's real." She walked back to the desk and picked up the transcript and read the second paragraph one more time. "Reinhold's version is a distortion of a true thing. That's the most dangerous kind of lie, not invented from nothing, but real facts assembled to point in the wrong direction." She set it down. "So we need to move before he finishes pointing Galloway in that direction." He watched her. The thing in his face that she'd been cataloging since the first morning, the quality of his attention when she did something he hadn't anticipated, was fully present now, and she was too tired and too clear-headed to pretend she didn't notice it. "You said together," she said, "last night. I'm holding you to it. What do we have?" He pulled a second document from the desk and slid it toward her. "Victor identified 3 of the peripheral associates Reinhold has approached. 2 of them have existing financial relationships with the Voss organization that give us a conversation. We can request a face-to-face before Reinhold closes his pitch. The 3rd is Galloway, and Galloway is going to be harder because Reinhold got there first. I want to talk to Galloway myself." Adrian looked up from the paper. "That's not... If you send Victor, Galloway hears the organization defending itself. If you go, he hears a man protecting his position." She held his gaze. "If I go, he hears the wife Reinhold told him doesn't know she's a piece on a board walking into his office of her own accord and telling him what actually happened." He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she could hear the building around them. A door somewhere below, the distant sound of the street, the ordinary ambient life of a place that was not aware it was at the center of something. "Galloway is not a safe conversation," he said. "I'm not asking for safe. He will look for inconsistency. He'll push. Let him push." Adrian looked at her for another beat. Then he picked up his phone and typed a brief message and set it down. "I'll arrange the meeting." She nodded. She picked up her coffee and found it had gone cold and drank it anyway. The meeting with Galloway was set for 2 days later at a private dining room on the 3rd floor of a members' club in the north part of the city. Evelyn spent those 2 days preparing with the same method she used to prepare for difficult parent conferences, not scripting, which produced rigidity, but building a complete understanding of the terrain so that she could move through it without a map. Victor briefed her on Galloway's history, his associations, his particular style of testing people. He liked silence, Victor told her. He'd let it extend past the point of comfort and watch what people did with it. What do people usually do? She asked. Fill it, Victor said. Say more than they should. All right. She also spent an hour on the evening before the meeting sitting with Adrian in the study, going through the documentation, her father's documentation, the full file, the dated records, and the corroborated testimony, and the paper trail of a betrayal that had been sitting in a locked drawer for 8 months, waiting for whoever had the right to open it. She read all of it, every page. Adrian sat across from her and said nothing while she read, which she appreciated. When she finished, she stacked the pages carefully and set them on the desk. He called your father the morning before he pulled out, she said. The transcript is on page 7. He said the deal was solid. Yes. And then he spent the next 23 years. She stopped. Started again. He sat at dinner tables with me and talked about integrity in business. He used that specific word. Integrity. She looked at the stack of pages. He gave a speech at my school's fundraiser 4 years ago about the importance of keeping your word. Adrian said nothing. I'm going to need to sit with this for a while, she said. But not now. Now I need to put it somewhere and focus on Galloway. You don't have to use it in the meeting. I know. She stood. But I might. The dining room at the members' club was small and oak-paneled and smelled like leather and old money, and Thomas Galloway was already seated when Evelyn arrived. He was 63, broad-shouldered, with the unhurried physicality of a man who had spent his life making rooms adjust to him rather than adjusting to rooms. He stood when she entered because he was a man of a certain generation and certain habits, and he shook her hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive. She had come alone. This had been the most contentious part of the preparation. Adrian had argued, Victor had argued, and she had listened to both arguments and then said no. The point was that she was not a piece being moved. She could not make that point with anyone standing behind her. Galloway looked at the door when she came in, waiting for someone to follow her. When no one did, something moved briefly in his expression. Then he gestured to the seat across from him. They ordered. They exchanged the preliminary currency of polite conversation. The club, the city, the winter. He was good at it, she noticed. The warmth was real enough that it would have worked on someone who needed warmth from him. She let it be what it was and didn't reach for it. When the food arrived, he set down his fork after one bite and looked at her. Mr. Reinhold tells me your marriage was a business arrangement. My marriage is legal and documented, she said. What it began as and what it is now are not the same thing. That's usually true of marriages. He tells me your husband had a file on your father before he met you. He did. My husband has been thorough about understanding his family's history. She held Galloway's gaze. Would you have respected him less for that? A small pause. What's in the file? That's between my family and his, but I'll tell you this. She picked up her fork. What my father did to the Voss family 23 years ago was wrong. I've read the documentation. I'm not going to defend it or minimize it. She ate. Let the silence go where it needed to go. I'm also not responsible for it. Neither is Adrian. And Reinhold using a 23-year-old betrayal as a wedge to take what doesn't belong to him. She set the fork down. That's not justice for the Voss family. That's opportunism dressed up as justice. And I think you know the difference. Galloway looked at her for a long time. He had a poker face that was genuinely good, the kind built over decades rather than practiced in a mirror. But she could see the calibration happening behind it. You came here alone, he said. Yes. Why? Because Reinhold told you I don't know I'm a piece on a board. I wanted you to see that he was wrong about that. Another silence. He let it run long. Victor had been right about that. The silence had a specific quality, extended and deliberate, designed to produce something. She let it run with him and did not fill it. Finally, he said, What does your husband want from me? Neutrality, she said. That's all. Don't move toward Reinhold. Don't move toward us. Let it settle on its own terms. And if Reinhold offers me something concrete, then you'll make your decision. I'm not here to outbid him. I'm here to make sure you have accurate information when you make it. He studied her. You're not what I expected. I know. She picked up her fork again. Reinhold told you what to expect. The meeting lasted another 40 minutes. They talked about other things: Galloway's history with the Port District Associations, a development project on the eastern waterfront that he had opinions about, the particular way the city had changed in the past decade. She listened carefully and said what was true and did not perform anything. When she stood to leave, he stood with her. I'll consider what you said, he told her. That's all I'm asking. She took the car back to the residence. Victor met her in the entrance hall with the look of a man who had been waiting with more tension than he was displaying. She told him how it went. He nodded twice and went to brief Adrian. She went upstairs. She sat in the sitting room with the winter landscape and felt the weight of the day settle into her body. The accumulated hours of it, the tension she had held through the Galloway meeting, the 2 days of preparation, and underneath all of it, the slow ongoing burn of her father's file, those dated pages, the transcript of a phone call from 23 years ago in which a man used the word solid to describe something he was already planning to let collapse. She fell asleep in the chair. She woke at 2 a.m. to her phone buzzing against the side table. The room was dark. The winter landscape was a shadow across the wall. She picked up the phone with the disoriented heaviness of someone pulled from deep sleep and looked at the screen. It was Nora. She answered. Evelyn? Nora's voice had a quality she'd heard before, the stripped-down version, the one with no performance in it, the voice that meant something real had happened. I need you to listen to me. I'm listening. I had dinner tonight with Claire Alderman. You remember Claire? She was in our cohort, moved to corporate law after graduation. She's been working in financial services litigation for 5 years. A pause. She mentioned a case. She didn't name anyone, client privilege, but she was describing a situation that she said had come across her desk this week. Nora? A legal challenge to a marriage, specifically to the validity of a marriage contracted under duress, citing evidence that one party possessed prior knowledge of the other party's identity before the alleged chance meeting. Another pause. She said the evidence was documented, time-stamped communications, a surveillance record. Evelyn sat up in the chair. The sleep fell away from her completely. Someone has surveillance documentation, she said. That places Adrian in the vicinity of Harrington Hall, Nora said, in the 2-hour window before your wedding, before he supposedly met you by chance. The room was very dark and very quiet. Claire said the filing is going to court, Nora continued. She said the client believes it will void the marriage entirely. Evelyn, if the marriage is voided, the inheritance window reopens, Evelyn said. Her own voice sounded strange to her, flat, like something from which air had been removed. I don't know if it's real, Nora said. I don't know if the surveillance documentation is real, but I need to make a call. I'll phone you back. She ended the call. She sat in the dark for exactly 30 seconds, and in those 30 seconds she felt the geometry of everything she'd built in the past 8 days reorganize itself around a single question that she had asked him on the first morning in this house, and that he had answered and that she had believed. Did you know who I was when you found me on the sidewalk? No. She stood up. She walked out of the sitting room and down the corridor and down the stairs into the study door and knocked twice. There was a light under the door. He was still awake. Come in, he said. She opened the door. He was at the desk, the same position as every other time she'd come to find him at night. The legal pad, the phones, the compressed handwriting. He looked up and read something in her face immediately. The way she was learning, he always read her, and he set down the pen. There's a legal challenge, she said, to the validity of our marriage. It's being filed this week. It cites surveillance documentation placing you near Harrington Hall before we met. She stood in the doorway and looked at him across the room. I'm going to ask you one question, and I need the true answer. I need it before whatever explanation you're building. He said nothing. He was very still. Were you there, she said, near the venue, that morning before I walked out? The silence in the study was the longest silence he had ever given her. And in that silence, in the specific quality of it, the weight of it, the way he looked at her with something that was not quite guilt but was not innocence either. She felt the floor of everything she had built in 8 days crack cleanly down the middle. "Tell me the truth," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "Right now. Tell me exactly what happened." He put both hands flat on the desk. He looked at them. Then he looked at her. "I went to find you," he said. It wasn't." He stopped. Started again with the care of a man who understood that the next few sentences were the most important he had ever said. "I knew the Hartwell name was connected to the wedding venue from the social notice. I was trying to identify whether Richard Hartwell would be present. I was still working through what to do with the documentation. I drove past the venue. I didn't go in. I wasn't looking for you specifically. I didn't know you existed. I was looking at the building. And then I drove away. I parked 2 blocks over and I called Victor and we argued about the documentation for 40 minutes, and then I walked, and you came around the corner." She stood in the doorway and looked at him. "You were there," she said. "Surveillance can document that you were there. Reinhold can take that documentation and build the same story he already told Galloway, but now with evidence. And he can put it in front of a court and say you planned it. Say you positioned yourself. Say the whole morning was orchestrated. The surveillance won't show me going in. It won't show any contact before you walked into me." "It doesn't have to." She heard her own voice go hard in a way it hadn't been before. A new edge in it, something that hadn't been there 8 days ago in the bridal suite. "Proximity is enough. Proximity plus your possession of the documentation plus the speed of the marriage. Reinhold doesn't need to prove intent. He needs to create doubt, and you've given him the geography to do it." She turned and walked out. She went back upstairs and sat in the dark of the sitting room and did not look at the winter landscape because she could not see it anyway. She sat with the information and she felt it, genuinely felt it, all the way through, not the managed distance she'd been applying to the hard things since that morning in the bridal suite. She felt the specific shape of it. A man who had been in the vicinity of the place that had destroyed her morning before that morning existed, who had driven past, who had argued with his advisor about a file with her father's name on it, who had then stood on a sidewalk and looked at her with gray dark eyes and asked her a question and told her exactly what the arrangement was, and then spent 8 days being honest with her in ways she hadn't expected and hadn't planned for. She believed him. That was the devastating part. She believed the account he had given, the drive past, the call to Victor, the walk, the accident of their collision. She believed it because it was consistent with every other thing she had learned about how he moved through problems, methodically, without obvious intention, taking in information before deciding what to do with it. She believed him, and it didn't matter. Because what Reinhold had was not a lie. It was a true fact pointed in a direction that would dismantle everything: the marriage, the inheritance, Adrian's position, and whatever the two of them had been building in the space between a contract and something neither of them had named yet. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. The third one. Different digits again. "Tomorrow morning. The Meridian Building, 14th floor. Come alone. I can give you what you need to stop Reinhold, but only you, not Voss, not Victor, you." She read it 3 times. Then she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Quiet, deliberate. Adrian's footsteps. She knew them by now, the specific weight and pace of them. He stopped outside her door. A long pause. He didn't knock. After a moment, the footsteps moved away. She looked at the text message on her screen and understood, with a clarity that felt like something physical moving through her, that the next choice she made was going to determine not just what happened to her, but what happened to everyone in this building and whatever they were all, collectively, trying to hold together. She could wake Adrian, show him the message, hand it over and let the organization handle it the way the organization handled things. Or she could go alone. She thought about what Galloway had seen when she'd walked into that dining room without anyone behind her. She thought about what Reinhold's filing would do to Adrian's position if it reached a court before they had anything to counter it with. She thought about her father's voice saying, "Think about this family," and about what it had cost her to stop thinking about that family and start thinking about herself. She made her decision. She set an alarm for 5:30 in the morning. And in an office across the city, in a building that wasn't the Meridian building, Reinhold sat across from a man who had been inside the Voss residence for 11 years. Not Marcus the lawyer, someone older, someone closer. And said, "She'll come. Women like that always come when you tell them they're the only one who can fix it." The man across from him said nothing. He just nodded once, slowly, the way men nod when they have already decided something and are simply waiting for the world to catch up to their decision. Evelyn did not sleep. She lay on the bed in the borrowed dark and stared at the ceiling and let her mind work the way it worked best when she didn't try to steer it, sideways, through the texture of things, through the small details that didn't announce themselves as important but were, the unknown number, the specific phrasing, only you, not Voss, not Victor. The fact that whoever sent it knew those two names and their precise positions in her life. The fact that they had sent 3 messages from 3 different numbers, which meant either resources or paranoia, and in her experience, those 2 things usually came packaged together in people who had done something they needed to protect. At 4:15, she got up. She dressed in the dark, practical clothes, flat shoes, nothing that would slow her down. She stood at the window and looked at the garden one more time. The stone bench, the winter roses, the pale gray field of the painting that had been sitting in her chest for 8 days like a compass point. She picked up her phone and typed a message to Nora. "Meridian Building, 14th floor, this morning. If you don't hear from me by 9, call Victor. Number is in my contacts." She sent it. Then she did something she hadn't planned to do. She walked back to the door, opened it quietly, went down the corridor and knocked twice on the study door. Silence. Then, "Come in." He hadn't slept either. He was at the desk, the same as always, but the legal pad was closed and he was just sitting, which was the first time she had seen him simply sit without working, and it made him look different, more tired, more human, more like a man who had been carrying something for a very long time. She stood in the doorway. "I'm going somewhere this morning," she said. "Alone. I need you to trust that." He looked at her. The exhaustion in his face was real and unguarded in the pre-dawn quiet. "Where?" "I'll tell you everything when I come back." "Evelyn. Adrian." She held his gaze across the room. "You asked me to stay the first morning. You gave me the full truth of what I was walking into, or as much of it as you had. I'm asking you now to extend me the same thing you needed from me then." She paused. "Trust that I know what I'm doing." The silence between them had a different quality than all the other silences. Not calculation, not management, just 2 people at 4 in the morning looking at each other across a room they had both ended up in by accident. "Come back," he said, simply. No condition attached. "I intend to," she said. She walked out of the residence into the cold morning air, and the city received her the same way it had on the worst morning of her life, without ceremony, without judgment, ordinary and indifferent, and full of everything that was about to happen. The Meridian building was 22 stories of glass and steel in the financial district, the kind of structure that had been built in the 90s with the aggressive confidence of money that believed in itself completely. At 5:53 in the morning, it was mostly dark, the lobby lit by the overnight security lighting that turned everything the color of old bone. A guard at the desk looked up when Evelyn pushed through the revolving door, and she gave her name. Her real name, Evelyn Hartwell, not Voss, a decision she'd made on the walk over and hadn't fully examined yet. And he checked a list on his screen and nodded, and told her 14th floor someone would meet her. The elevator was mirrored on 3 sides. She watched herself rise. She looked like someone who hadn't slept. She looked like someone who had dressed in the dark and walked 20 minutes through cold air, and was now standing in a mirrored box going up to a meeting she'd agreed to via anonymous text message at 2 in the morning. She looked, she thought, exactly like what she was. A woman who had stopped waiting for the situation to become safe before moving through it. The doors opened on 14. The floor was open plan, unoccupied, the kind of generic corporate space between tenants, empty desks, bare walls, the gray carpet of a place that was between one version of itself and another. The overhead lights were off. The city came through the floor-to-ceiling windows in the thin early light, the grid of it laid out below like something that had been planned by a person who believed in order and then built by everyone else. A man was standing at the far end of the floor near the windows. He was not what she'd expected, though she hadn't let herself form a specific expectation, because expectation was a liability in rooms she didn't know yet. He was in his late 50s, medium height, wearing a coat that was good quality but not new, and he had the face of someone who had been tired for so long that the tiredness had become structural, built into the lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth. She crossed the floor toward him. Her footsteps on the carpet made almost no sound. "Mrs. Voss?" he said. "Who are you?" "My name is Brennan. I worked for Reinhold for 9 years." He paused. "Until 3 weeks ago." She stopped 6 feet from him, close enough to read his face, far enough to have a second before anything physical could close the distance. "Why did you stop?" "Because I found out what he's planning to do after he takes the Voss organization." Brennan looked at her with the careful, depleted expression of a man who had been holding something for 3 weeks and was not sure anymore what it weighed. "Reinhold isn't interested in running what Voss built. He's going to strip it, sell the legitimate holdings, dissolve the associations, take the liquid assets, and move them offshore. The people who've worked under the Voss organization for 20 years, the ones who have legitimate businesses, the ones who built real things, they'll have nothing." "That's not why you left," she said. He looked at her. "That's the reason you're giving. It's not the reason you left." She kept her voice level. "People who leave over principle do it in the moment. They don't wait 3 weeks and arrange pre-dawn meetings. What did Reinhold do that you couldn't stay for?" Brennan was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced a folded envelope and held it out. She didn't take it yet. "He authorized something," Brennan said. "Against you specifically. Not legal. Not a filing. Not a challenge." He kept the envelope extended. "He has people watching the residence. He's been patient about it because the legal route was still viable. But after your meeting with Galloway, after Galloway told him what you said, Reinhold decided the legal route isn't going to be enough." She felt her heartbeat in her throat. "What does the envelope contain?" "Documentation of the authorization. Dates, names, the specific instruction." He paused. "He wants the marriage to end. Permanently. Not voided. Ended. Voss without you is a man who can be managed. With you, he's—" Brennan stopped. "Reinhold said it to his associate 3 days ago. He said Voss found something he wasn't supposed to find, and it's going to make him harder to move." She took the envelope. She opened it. Inside were 3 pages. The first was a printed message chain. The second was a photograph. Adrian entering the Meridian building, time-stamped 6 days ago, which meant Reinhold had been documenting their movements for nearly the entire time she'd been in the residence. The third was a single-typed page with the name she didn't recognize at the top, and below it 2 lines of instruction that were written in the direct, unambiguous language of someone who had given this kind of instruction before and was not interested in deniability. Her hands were steady. She was faintly surprised by this. "The name at the top of the 3rd page," she said. "Where is he now?" "I don't know. I've been trying to locate him for 5 days." Brennan's voice had the texture of someone telling the truth because they had run out of the energy required to construct something better. "I think he's already in position." She looked up from the pages. "In position where?" "Reinhold has a meeting scheduled this morning, 10 a.m., with the 3 peripheral associates, Galloway included. He's going to present the surveillance documentation and make the formal case that the marriage was engineered. He's going to ask all 3 of them to sign a joint statement supporting the legal challenge." A pause. "The man on the 3rd page is supposed to make sure that Voss doesn't attend that meeting, doesn't attend anything after this morning." The city outside the windows was beginning to lighten. The grid of it was becoming specific, the shapes of individual buildings emerging from the early gray. "How long have you known this?" she said. "The authorization was 4 days ago." 4 days. "I was trying to find a way that didn't require—" He stopped. "That didn't require you to take on the liability of handing this to the people Reinhold is trying to destroy," she said. She felt no particular anger about it. It was a human calculation, and she understood human calculations. "You needed to be sure I'd be useful enough to protect you from whatever Reinhold does when he finds out you gave me this." Brennan said nothing, which was its own answer. I'll take the envelope, she said. And I need a name. Someone inside Reinhold's operation who can corroborate this in front of Galloway and the other associates. Someone who will still be there when this goes to the room. There's a woman named Sears. She manages his financial filings. She doesn't know about the authorization, but she has access to the documentation of the surveillance operation. She processes the payments for the contractors. He produced a business card and held it out. She's been looking for a way out for 2 years. Reinhold has something on her. If you can offer her clean passage, she'll give you the surveillance records and testify to their origin. She took the card. She looked at Brennan for a moment, at the tired lines and the depleted eyes and the coat that was good quality but not new. And she thought about the category of person who served the wrong thing for 9 years and then found the one line they couldn't cross and had to decide what to do about it. "Thank you," she said. She walked back across the empty floor to the elevator. In the lobby, she took out her phone and called Victor. He answered on the second ring, which told her he'd been awake and waiting. "I need you to find a woman named Sears who manages financial filings for Reinhold's operation," she said. "I need her located and I need someone to make contact in the next 2 hours. I'll explain everything when I'm back. Is Adrian there?" "He's here." A pause. "He's been here." "Tell him I'm coming." She pushed through the revolving door into the morning, and the cold hit her face and she started moving, the envelope inside her coat against her ribs, and she had walked half a block when she heard footsteps behind her. Specific footsteps, not the random percussion of early morning pedestrians, but footsteps that were matching her pace, adjusting when she adjusted, and she felt the knowledge of it move through her body before her mind finished processing it. She did not run. Running was information. She kept her pace and took the next left and then an immediate right into a narrow service alley between 2 buildings, and she put her back against the wall beside a dumpster and waited. The man who came around the corner was large and wearing a dark jacket and had the particular economy of movement that belonged to people who had trained their bodies to be functional rather than expressive. He saw her immediately. She hadn't hidden, just repositioned. And he stopped at the alley entrance and they looked at each other across 15 feet of gray morning space. "I just need the envelope," he said. His voice was unhurried, professional. "I know what you were authorized to do," she said. "The envelope is documented elsewhere. Taking it from me doesn't close the problem." Something moved in his expression, brief, a recalculation. "Walk away," she said. "Tell Reinhold you couldn't find me. Whatever he pays you for this morning is not worth what comes after, because what comes after is the full weight of the Voss organization looking for whoever was in this alley." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without flinching, and she was aware of her heartbeat, loud, steady, faster than normal but not out of control, and the cold against her back through her jacket, and the specific weight of the decision she was watching him make. He turned and walked away. She let out a breath that she had not been aware of holding. She waited 30 seconds. Then she walked back out of the alley and continued toward the residence at a pace that was faster than before. Adrian was in the entrance hall when she came through the door. Not in the study, not upstairs. In the entrance hall, which meant he had been there for a while. Standing in the space between waiting and moving, held in place by the thing she'd asked of him at 4 a.m, trust. He looked at her face and then at the envelope she pulled from inside her coat and extended toward him, and he took it, and she watched him open it and read, and she watched his face while he read, the stillness of it, the compression around his jaw, and then something that moved through his eyes that was not quite fear and was not quite anger, but was the specific expression of a man confronting the full dimensions of a threat that had been closer than he'd known. "Reinhold's meeting is at 10, she said. "We have 4 hours. Victor is trying to locate a woman named Sears who can give us the surveillance records. If we have those records in hand before the meeting, we have something Reinhold can't talk around." She paused. "The legal challenge goes away when you can show the associates that the surveillance operation was Reinhold's, that he built the documentation specifically to manufacture the narrative. It stops being evidence of what he claims and starts being evidence of what he is." Adrian looked up from the pages. "You were followed." "Yes." He left. "Evelyn, I'm fine," she said it cleanly. "I need you focused on the 10 o'clock meeting, not on the alley." He looked at her for a long moment with an expression she had never seen on his face before. something open and unguarded and not quite managed, the look of a man who has prepared himself for a great many things and has encountered something he did not prepare for. "Victor," he said, without looking away from her. Victor appeared from the study doorway. "Already on Sears," he said. "I have an address. She's home." "Go," Adrian said. Victor went. The next 3 hours were the most compressed Evelyn had experienced since the morning the whole thing began. She sat at the long desk in the study with Adrian and 2 of the lawyers, and they built the case. Not a legal case, not yet, but the evidentiary architecture that would make Reinholdt's version of events collapse in a room full of men who needed a reason to choose correctly. Victor reached Sears at 7:40. She was, as Brennan had said, a woman who had been looking for a way out for 2 years, and when Victor explained what clean passage would look like, her cooperation was immediate and total. The surveillance records arrived electronically at 8:15. 3 weeks of contractor payments, the specific dates, the account routing that traced back without ambiguity to Reinholdt's operational fund. At 8:45, Evelyn looked at the assembled documentation and said, "It's enough." One of the lawyers said, "For a court, eventually. For this morning it's enough," she said. "Galloway and the other 2 aren't judges. They're men trying to decide which direction is stable. This gives them stability. That's all they need." Adrian looked at her from across the desk. "You're coming to the meeting." It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "Reinholdt will be there." "I know. He authorized something against you this morning and it didn't work and he doesn't know that yet. When he sees you walk in, he'll know his timeline collapsed." She held Adrian's gaze. "Good. I want him to know that before anyone else in the room does. I want him to look at me, walk in, and understand that whatever he thought he had, he doesn't have it anymore." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then he stood up from the desk and picked up his phone and his coat, and he looked at her with that expression again, the open, unguarded one, and said, "Let's go." The meeting was in a private room on the 2nd floor of a hotel in the Central District, the kind of neutral ground venue that these arrangements traditionally used, anonymous enough that no one's presence was an automatic concession. Reinholdt was already there when Adrian and Evelyn walked in, and she had been watching for his reaction, and she got it, a fractional tightening around his eyes. The compressed recalibration of a man seeing a variable that should have been removed from the equation still standing in the doorway in a navy coat with a file in her hands. Galloway was there. 2 other men she identified from Victor's briefings as Marr and Deshane. All 3 looked at her with the evaluating attention of people updating a file. Reinholdt recovered quickly. He was good at it. The surface returned in under 2 seconds. The composed authority of a man who had built his position over decades and was not going to let it show when something surprised him. "This is a principals meeting," he said. "Mrs. Voss is a principal," Adrian said. He said it without heat, without emphasis, just as a fact that the room was going to accommodate. Reinholdt looked at Galloway. Galloway looked at Evelyn. She set the file on the table. "I'd like to address something before we begin," she said. "Mr. Reinholdt has prepared documentation for this meeting that he's going to present as evidence that my marriage to Adrian Voss was engineered. Surveillance records placing Adrian near Harrington Hall on the morning of our wedding." She kept her voice even and her eyes moving across all 5 faces in the room. Reinholdt, Galloway, Marr, Deshane, and the 4th man in the corner she'd clocked when she walked in, the one whose stillness was professional rather than natural. "I'd like to show you where that surveillance came from before he does." She opened the file. The account records were on top. She had arranged them deliberately. The clearest documentation first, the one that required the least explanation, the one whose meaning was unambiguous the moment you looked at it. "These are the payment records for the contractor operation that generated the surveillance," she said. "The routing traces to Reinholdt's operational fund. The dates begin 9 days ago. 6 days before Marcus's access to our legal documents was discovered, 3 days before the legal challenge was formally drafted." She looked at Reinholdt. He built the evidence after he decided what the narrative needed to be. The surveillance doesn't document what happened. It documents what he needed it to look like. The room was very quiet. Reinholdt said, "Those records are fabricated." The bank routing isn't, said the lawyer who had come with them and who now placed a second set of pages on the table. The corroborating verification that Victor had obtained in the 3 hours between her return from the Meridian building and this moment. We have the originating account confirmed by 2 independent sources, one of whom is a member of your own financial team. Reinhold's composure held. She gave him credit for it. But she could see it holding, could see the specific effort of it, the way a structure looks when it's bearing weight it wasn't built for. Galloway, Reinhold said, I've known you for 14 years, Galloway said. He was looking at the account records with the reading glasses he'd produced from his breast pocket, and his voice had the quality of a man who has made his decision and is now simply completing the administrative work of it. And I've known that you've been waiting for a specific window for 3 years, and I know the difference between documentation that arrives and documentation that was built. He looked up. I've seen both. Marr, the second associate, leaned forward and picked up the top page. He examined it for 30 seconds. He set it down. Deshane said nothing, but he pushed back slightly from the table. A small physical withdrawal, barely perceptible, the body language of someone removing themselves from a side they had not yet formally joined. Reinhold stood up. He was controlled. She had expected something more volatile, the specific anger of a man whose long plan has just been dismantled in front of an audience. But what he gave the room instead was something colder, a compression that made the air in the room feel different in a way that moved along her skin. He looked at Evelyn, not at Adrian, at her. You have no idea, he said quietly, what you just stepped into. She held his gaze across the table without blinking. Her heart was going fast, and she could feel the pulse of it in her throat, and her hands were flat on the table, and she was aware of every person in the room with the specific, heightened clarity of a moment that is going to matter for a long time. I think I do, she said. Reinhold picked up his coat. He looked at Galloway one more time, a long, final look, the look of a man filing away a reckoning for later. And then he walked to the door. He stopped at the threshold. The filing is already submitted, he said, without turning around. The legal challenge is in the system. You've won this room. You haven't won the case. A pause. And the case has details in it that none of you have seen yet. He left. The door closed. The room held the silence he left behind. Galloway took off his reading glasses and folded them. Marr was looking at the table. Deshane had his hands in his lap. The lawyer beside Adrian was writing something on his legal pad with the focused efficiency of a man capturing what had just happened before it could be revised. Evelyn looked at Adrian. He was looking at her. The open expression again, raw at the edges, not managed, the face of a man who was done performing composure for a room and was looking at the specific person in it who had just changed the shape of everything. The filing, he said quietly, to the lawyer. We can challenge the submission, the lawyer said, but Reinhold said it has details we haven't seen. If he's held something back, he has, said the man in the corner. The fourth man, the still one. He stood up from his chair, and Evelyn saw now that he was younger than she'd registered, mid-30s, with the look of someone who had been waiting for his moment in this room and had just arrived at it. Everyone turned. My name is Carver, he said. I've been working inside Reinhold's operation for 14 months. He looked at Adrian. I work for your father's oldest associate, a man named Stern, who has been building a case against Reinhold since before your father died. He reached into his jacket and produced a drive. Small, black, the size of a thumb. The filing Reinhold submitted this morning contains a document that implicates someone in this room. Not you. He looked at Evelyn. Not Voss. Someone who has been in the operation for over a decade, who Reinhold has been protecting because they've been useful, and who Reinhold is now going to sacrifice because he needs the filing to have weight. He set the drive on the table. The room was absolutely still. Who? Adrian said. Carver looked at him. Victor, he said. The word arrived in the room and detonated quietly, the way the worst things always do. Not with noise, not with visible destruction, but with the specific vibration of something structural giving way somewhere below the surface, something that had been holding the weight of everything and was now gone. Adrian did not move. That was the thing. He went completely still in the way that Evelyn had learned meant the opposite of calm. The stillness of a man whose internal architecture was absorbing an impact so significant that the body had simply stopped while it processed. She watched his face. She watched the specific sequence move through it. Disbelief first, lasting less than a second because he was too intelligent to let disbelief run long, and then something that was not quite grief but lived in the same neighborhood. And then the cold, final settling of a man who has just learned that the person he trusted most completely had been the opening in the wall the entire time. "How long?" Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. 14 months that we can document, Carver said. Possibly longer. What did he give them? Internal communications, financial routing, the location of 3 off-site holdings that Reinhold hasn't moved on yet because he was waiting for the legal challenge to close first. Carver nodded toward the drive. It's all there. Stern's team compiled it over 8 months. Galloway stood up. He buttoned his jacket with the deliberate movements of a man completing a transaction and moving on. "I've seen enough," he said. He looked at Adrian. "The statement Reinhold wanted. It's not happening. Not from me." He glanced at Marr, who gave a short nod. Deshane, after a moment, did the same. They filed out. The lawyer followed, already on his phone. Evelyn and Adrian were alone with Carver. "Where's Victor now?" she said. "At the residence," Carver said. "He doesn't know about the filing yet. Reinhold submitted it this morning while Victor was running the Sears contact. Reinhold timed it deliberately. He wanted Victor in motion, useful, so no one was watching him." She looked at Adrian. He was staring at the drive on the table with an expression she had no category for yet, something she had not seen on him before, something that lived below the controlled surface in the place where the things that actually cost you something were kept. "We need to go back," she said quietly. He picked up the drive. He held it for a moment, just held it, looking at it, the way you look at an object that has changed what you know about your own life. Then he put it in his pocket and picked up his coat and walked to the door and held it open for her, and she walked through it, and they went down to the car in silence. And in the silence was everything that didn't need to be said yet. The full weight of Victor's name, the legal filing still moving through the system, Reinhold out in the city regrouping, and the thing between them that had no name but was real and present and was going to have to be enough to build the next part on. The car pulled into traffic. Adrian's phone rang. He looked at the screen. He looked at her. "It's Victor," he said. The city moved past the windows, indifferent and enormous, and Evelyn Hartwell looked at the man she had married on the worst morning of her life and said, "Answer it." Adrian answered the phone. He held it to his ear and said nothing at first, just listened, and Evelyn watched his face in the moving light of the car windows, the city sliding past in pieces, and she saw the moment the call confirmed what Carver had told them. It wasn't dramatic. It was small and specific. A tightening at the corner of his left eye, a breath that came out slightly slower than the one before it. The face of a man receiving information he had already prepared himself for and finding that preparation was not the same as readiness. "Stay at the residence," Adrian said into the phone. "Don't touch anything on the system. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He ended the call. The car was quiet. "He called to tell you about the filing," she said. "Yes." "His version of it." "Yes." She looked out the window. A woman on the sidewalk was walking a dog that had stopped to investigate something near a lamppost, and the woman was standing with the patient resignation of someone who had learned that certain things couldn't be hurried. "What did he say?" "That Reinhold's team filed the challenge this morning without his knowledge. That he discovered it an hour ago. That he wants to explain." Adrian's voice was flat in the specific way it went flat when he was holding something at distance to keep it functional. "He said there are things I don't understand about the situation." "There might be." He looked at her. "I'm not defending him," she said. "I'm saying that 14 months is a long time to be doing something, and long things usually have a beginning that looks different from the middle." She held his gaze. "You should hear what it was before you decide what it is." He was quiet for the rest of the drive. Victor was in the study when they arrived. He was standing rather than sitting, which Evelyn had learned was unusual for him. Victor was a man who used furniture deliberately, who sat when he wanted to signal patience and stood when he wanted to signal readiness. And he was standing now in the center of the room with the look of a man who had decided somewhere between the phone call and their arrival to stop managing how things appeared and simply be present for what was coming. He was 61 years old and had been with the Voss family for 22 years. He had white hair cut short and hands that had the careful steadiness of someone who had spent decades handling things that required steadiness. He looked at Adrian when they walked in, and then he looked at Evelyn, and the look he gave her was not a plea and not an apology, but something more complicated. The look of a man acknowledging that the person in the room who was going to determine the quality of the next 10 minutes was not the one he'd known for 2 decades. "Sit down," Adrian said. Victor sat. Adrian remained standing. Evelyn took the chair near the window. Outside, the winter garden, the stone bench. And she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. "Tell me when it started," Adrian said. Victor looked at his own hands for a moment. Then he looked up. 3 years ago, 2 months after your father died." He said it without preamble, without the cushioning language that people used when they were confessing to things and hoping the packaging would soften the content. "Reinhold approached me. Not about the inheritance. The window hadn't opened formally yet. He came to me about the documentation, your father's files. He told me he knew the files existed and that he wanted to understand the scope of them before he made any moves. And you told him." "I told him the files were being reviewed. I didn't give him content. Not then." Victor paused. "Then 4 months later he came back. He had something on me. A transaction from 8 years ago. A financial arrangement I made on your father's behalf that was not legal. Your father knew about it. I thought it died with him." He stopped. "It didn't." The room was very quiet. "What did he ask for?" Adrian said. "Timing, movement. When you were traveling, when the residence was at reduced capacity. He wasn't asking for strategy, Bess. He said he just wanted to understand the operational rhythm." Victor's voice was steady, but the steadiness was costing him. She could hear it, the specific effort of a man speaking the full truth after a long time of not doing so. "I told myself it was minor, that I was protecting the larger thing by managing a smaller compromise." He looked at Adrian directly. "I was wrong. I knew I was wrong when I was doing it. I kept doing it anyway because the alternative was exposure, and I was a coward about it." The word coward landed in the room without any attempt to soften it. He had chosen it deliberately, she understood. Not self-flagellation, but precision. The right word for the right thing. Adrian had not moved from his position near the desk. He was looking at Victor with an expression that was not anger. Anger would have been easier, she thought, for both of them. It was something more interior than anger. The specific grief of a man discovering that a fixed point in his life was not fixed. "The location of the 3 off-site holdings," Adrian said. "He got those from you." "Yes?" "When?" 6 weeks ago. He told me it was the last thing he needed. I believed him because I wanted to believe him." Victor's jaw tightened. "He lied." "He was always going to lie." Adrian's voice didn't rise. "He was going to take everything you gave him and then use you as the expendable piece in the filing because a 22-year associate with documented access is more credible as a villain than a contractor they hired last month." Victor said nothing. He didn't disagree. Evelyn had been quiet through all of this, watching the 2 men and the specific weight of what was being redistributed in the room. The 22 years of it, the history and the loyalty and the betrayal, and the fear that had made the betrayal possible in the first place. She understood Victor's cowardice the way she understood her own family's. Not as an excuse, but as a human mechanism, the way people contracted around the thing they were most afraid to lose until the contraction itself became the wound. "Adrian," she said. He looked at her. "The filing names Victor as the source of the manufactured surveillance documentation," she said. "Reinhold's version says Victor coordinated it from inside the residence as a way to frame Reinhold's challenge as fabricated to protect you." She watched his face. "It's a double frame. Victor's real cooperation becomes, in Reinhold's filing, a fake cooperation that Victor is accused of inventing. You follow it." A beat. "He turns the truth into a lie by flipping the direction," Adrian said. If the court reads the filing without context, Victor looks like your man running a disinformation operation. Reinhold looks like the victim of it. She looked at Victor. Which means Victor is actually your best asset right now. Because the only thing that unravels Reinhold's filing is Victor walking into a room and telling the full account. The coercion, the timeline, everything. Before Reinhold's version becomes the established narrative. Victor looked at her. Something moved through his expression. Not relief, because this wasn't relief. Nothing about what was coming for him was going to feel like relief. But something that looked like a man finding the shape of the only decent option left to him. He'd be exposing himself, Adrian said. The original transaction, 8 years ago. Yes, she said. He would. The room held that. I'll do it, Victor said quietly. Adrian looked at him. It's the right thing, Victor said. It's the only thing I can give you that's worth anything. He paused. I should have made a different choice 3 years ago. I can't make that choice now, but I can make this one. Adrian was silent for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and sat down across from Victor, and the two of them looked at each other across the distance of 22 years and one large irrevocable mistake. And Evelyn watched Adrian's face and saw him work through something that was not forgiveness yet. Forgiveness was a longer process, she knew. It required time, and it required the wound to close enough to examine. But was the decision that preceded forgiveness, the choice to let someone be more than the worst thing they'd done? We move today, Adrian said, before Reinhold has time to build the narrative further. He looked at the lawyer who had come in quietly behind them. Get Carver in the drive. I want Victor's account recorded with independent counsel before noon. The lawyer moved. Adrian looked at Evelyn. The filing challenge. I'll call Nora, she said. She has a contact in financial services litigation. If we have Victor's account and Carver's documentation filed as a counter-response before the end of business today, we change the procedural landscape before the case gets a hearing date. He nodded once. She made the call. What followed was 6 hours of the specific, unglamorous labor of dismantling something that had been built to destroy you. Phone calls and documents and counterfilings, and the painstaking assembly of a record that told the true sequence in the unambiguous language that legal systems required. Nora's contact was a woman named Park, who worked with the focused, coffee-sustained efficiency of someone who genuinely enjoyed the complexity of what she was being handed. Victor recorded his account for 3 hours with independent counsel, and Evelyn sat in the room for part of it because Victor had asked her to. Not for support, she understood, but as a witness, as the person whose presence made the account feel like it was going somewhere real. At 4:15 in the afternoon, Park called and said the counter-response had been filed and accepted into the system, and that the judge assigned to the case had requested a preliminary review of both filings before granting a hearing date, which was procedurally unusual and strongly suggested that the bench had looked at the documentation and found the evidentiary conflict significant enough to examine before moving forward. What does that mean in practice? Evelyn asked. It means the filing doesn't move forward automatically, Park said. Reinhold needed momentum. Without it, his coalition fractures. And with Victor's account in the record, corroborated by Carver, and the financial documentation, the evidentiary foundation of his challenge is gone, she told Adrian. He was at the desk, the legal pad in front of him, and he put down the pen when she gave him Park's assessment, and he was quiet for a moment. And in that quiet, she could see the weight of the past 10 days. The surveillance, Marcus, Victor, Reinhold in the hotel room, the morning at the Meridian building, settling into him, finding its final position. It's not over, he said. Reinhold is still out there. I know. He'll regroup, find another angle. Probably. She sat down across from him. But the associations have seen what he does with the people around him. Galloway saw it this morning. That's not something he can undo. She held his gaze. You don't beat someone like Reinhold in a single day. You build a record of who he is until there's no one left who'll work with him. He looked at her for a long moment. When did you learn to think like this? He said. She almost said, I don't know. But that wasn't true. She knew exactly when. She'd been learning it for 27 years in a family that had treated her as a piece to be managed and had given her, in doing so, an unusually complete education in how people used the people around them and what the long-term cost of that usage was. I had good teachers, she said. They just didn't know they were teaching me. He held her gaze for another beat. Then something in his face settled. Not into happiness, because that was too clean and too easy for what this was, but into something quieter and more durable, the specific expression of a person arriving somewhere after a long journey and recognizing it as the right place. 3 days later, Richard Hartwell called his daughter. She was in the kitchen when the phone rang, standing at the counter with a cup of coffee, watching the private garden through the window. The winter roses were still bare, but something had changed in the light, a quality of the early morning that suggested, without committing to it, that the season was considering moving. She picked up the phone and looked at her father's name on the screen and felt the particular weight of it. Not the old weight, not the trained response of the daughter who needed his approval, but the cleaner, heavier weight of a woman who knew exactly what she was looking at. She answered, "Evelyn." Her father's voice had lost the prepared statement quality. What was underneath it was older and less controlled. "I need to speak with you." "You're speaking to me now." A pause. "In person. I need to see you." She looked at the garden. "Why?" "Because—" He stopped, started again. "Because there are things you know now about our family that I should have told you myself, years ago." Another pause. "And because your sister is—" His voice caught slightly, which was the first time in her memory that her father's voice had caught. "Camilla is having a very difficult time. The marriage— Daniel is— I'm not responsible for Camilla's marriage. I know that. And I'm not going to fix it for her. I know that too." A long pause. "I'm calling because I'm your father and I've done things that were wrong and I'm old enough now to know that there's a limited amount of time left to say so." The voice was rough, genuine. "I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I'm asking for the chance to say it to your face." She stood at the counter with the coffee going cold, and she felt the weight of the request move through her. The full, complicated weight of it, the 27 years of dinners and silences, and her father's prepared statements, and the moment in the bridal suite when he had looked her in the eye and asked her to disappear quietly for the family name. She felt all of it. Then she set down the coffee cup and said, "Thursday, 2 o'clock. There's a cafe on Mercer Street called Aldine. I'll be there for 1 hour." She ended the call. She did not feel victorious. She did not feel healed. She felt like a woman who had decided to look at a hard thing directly instead of around it, which was not the same as resolving it, but was the only way resolution eventually became possible. Adrian was behind her. She hadn't heard him come in. He moved quietly in the mornings, and she turned and found him leaning in the kitchen doorway with his own coffee, dressed but unhurried, watching her with the attentive patience she had come to know as his particular way of being present. "My father," she said. "I heard. I'm not doing it for him." "I know." He pushed off the doorframe and came to stand beside her at the counter. Outside, the garden was pale and still in the early light. "Thursday, I have a meeting in the financial district until 1:30. "I know. This is mine to do alone." He nodded. He looked out at the garden. She looked out at the garden. They stood together in the quiet of the kitchen with their coffee and the specific ease of two people who had stopped performing anything for each other, who had arrived at the particular comfort of shared space without the requirement of constant navigation. After a while, he said, "Sears reached out to Victor yesterday. She has documentation of 2 other operations Reinhold ran over the past 5 years, unrelated to the inheritance challenge. Victor thinks she's building toward full cooperation. That'll take time." "Yes." "We have time," she said. He looked at her then, a sideways look, brief and direct. "We do." She went back to teaching 3 weeks later. Not at her old school. That life had been disassembled in the specific way that lives are disassembled when everything changes at once, and she was not going to pretend she could walk back into it and pick up where she left off. But there was a program in the Eastern District that worked with children from disrupted homes, a twice-weekly after-school literacy program that was chronically underfunded and perpetually short of qualified teachers, and she had found it through a recommendation from Irene's daughter and had gone to observe one session and had watched a 7-year-old girl staring at a page with the focused, ferocious determination of someone trying to crack a code that everyone around her had already cracked, and she had known immediately that this was the place. The program coordinator, a tired and unsentimental woman named Flores, had looked at Evelyn's resume and then looked at Evelyn and said, "You're overqualified." "I know," Evelyn said. "You understand this isn't a full salary position. I have other income." Flores had looked at her for a long, evaluating moment and then said, "Tuesday and Thursday, 3 to 6. Don't be late." She was never late. The children were difficult in the way that children who had been disappointed by adults were difficult, not badly behaved mostly, but defended, careful about what they gave, quick to test the consistency of the person in front of them. Evelyn understood this from a place that was not theoretical. She showed up every Tuesday and Thursday, and she was the same person each time, not warmer or more patient than was natural for her, but consistent, and in the specific economy of trust that governed those rooms, consistency was the only currency that mattered. In the fourth week, a boy named Marcus, 7 years old, small for his age, with the watchful eyes of someone who had learned to read rooms quickly, looked up from his workbook and said, "Are you going to keep coming?" "Yes," she said. "People say that." "I know." She looked at him directly. "I'll be here next Tuesday. If I'm not, I'll tell you in advance and give you a reason." He looked at her for a long moment with the particular assessment of someone who has developed a very accurate internal instrument for detecting when adults were performing sincerity rather than delivering it. Then he looked back down at his workbook. He was there the next Tuesday. So was she. The Reinhold situation resolved itself over the following 2 months, not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through the slow, unglamorous accumulation of a record. Sears provided full cooperation in the 6th week. The documentation she brought covered 3 operations, 2 of which had implications for associates who had been sitting in careful neutrality, men who, when presented with evidence that Reinhold had been using them as proxies without their full knowledge, made the decision that self-interest required them to make. The legal challenge to the marriage was withdrawn in the 8th week, quietly, through a filing that cited insufficient evidentiary basis, which was the legal system's understated way of saying that what had been presented as evidence had been demonstrated to be its opposite. Galloway called Adrian the morning the withdrawal was filed. The call lasted 4 minutes. At the end of it, Adrian came to find Evelyn and said simply, "It's done." She was in the sitting room with student work spread across the low table, marking progress on a reading assessment. She looked up. "Reinhold," she said. "Galloway says he's gone to ground. The associations he was courting have closed their doors. Without a legal vehicle and without coalition support." Adrian shrugged. "He still exists, but he's operating from a very reduced position. He'll rebuild eventually. Probably. By then the record against him is established." He sat down across from her. "Victor is cooperating with an independent review of the past 3 years. He'll lose his formal position. I don't know yet what else." "What do you want to happen to him?" He was quiet for a moment. "He was afraid. He made a cowardly choice and then kept making it because he couldn't find a way out. I've known him for 22 years. He looked at his hands. I don't want him destroyed. I want him to deal with what he did. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at him across the spread of student papers. A month ago, she would have cataloged that answer, filed it as data, information about the kind of man she was learning. Now it just settled into the fuller picture she already had, the accumulated weight of who he was that didn't surprise her anymore. "Thursday," she said, "I'm having coffee with my father. I remember. I don't know how it's going to go." "No," he said, "you don't. I'm not going to fix anything. I'm going to listen and say what's true and see what he does with it. That's all you can do." "I know." She picked up the next assessment sheet. "It might not be enough." "It might not be," he agreed, "but you'll know you did the honest thing. That's not nothing." She looked at him. "My father told me that once," he said. Before the deal with your father. Before everything. He said the honest thing and the easy thing were almost never the same thing, and that the honest thing left you with less, but you could sleep on it. He paused. He was right about most of it. He was wrong about the less part. I think you end up with more. It just doesn't look like what you expected. She held his gaze for a long moment. Outside the window, the winter garden was different now. The roses on the trellis had produced the first small tentative growth of the new season, green at the tips of branches that had been bare since she'd arrived. She had been noticing it for a week. She hadn't said anything about it because some things were better observed than narrated. Adrian, she said. Yeah. The contract. She set down the assessment sheet. The settlement terms, the formal arrangement. She held his gaze. I don't want those anymore. He was very still. Not because I'm leaving, she said clearly, because what we have isn't a contract anymore and we both know it, and I don't want a legal document describing something that it's no longer the right description for. He looked at her for a long time. The study was quiet around them, the particular quiet of a place that had absorbed a great deal and had learned to hold it without noise. What do you want instead? He said. The same thing you do, she said. I think. He looked at her with the open, unguarded expression, the one she'd first seen in the hotel meeting room, the one that appeared when she did something he hadn't anticipated, and he stopped managing his response to it. He looked at her with that expression, and she let him look. All right, he said, simply, without performance. She picked up the next assessment sheet. He stayed in the room. The meeting with her father on Thursday lasted an hour and 40 minutes, which was longer than she'd planned. He was smaller than she remembered, sitting across from her in the cafe on Mercer Street. Not physically smaller, but reduced in the specific way that people are reduced when the authority they've worn for decades has been examined and found to be constructed rather than inherent. He ordered coffee, and he sat with his hands around the cup, and he told her about the deal 23 years ago with the directness of a man who had spent enough time with the truth to have stopped flinching from it. He said, I was afraid. The deal had complications I hadn't disclosed to the investors. I thought pulling out was protecting myself. I didn't let myself think about what it was doing to them. She listened. He said, I've known for 15 years that it was wrong. I've been telling myself it was business. It wasn't business. It was a choice I made, and I covered with the language of business. She said, I know. He looked at her. You've read the file. Yes. He was quiet. What is Adrian? What does he want to do with it? He's already decided, she said. He's not going to use it as a weapon. He's going to make it part of the record, the full record of what happened to his family, and then he's going to let it be what it is. History. She held her father's gaze. But it's going to exist. It's not going to be buried again. Her father looked at his coffee cup for a long moment. Then he looked up and said, Is there anything I can do? You can tell the same truth you just told me to Adrian's lawyer. On record. Voluntarily. She held his gaze. Not because it fixes anything, because it's the honest thing. He looked at her for a long time. She saw him working through it, the exposure of it, the permanent mark it would put on the name he had spent 60 years protecting. Okay, he said. She drove home through the city in the early evening, the streetlights coming on one by one as the day finished. She drove through the financial district and past the alley where she'd put her back against a wall 3 weeks ago and waited for a man to decide what to do. And she drove through the neighborhood where Harrington Hall sat dark and closed for the season. And she did not stop at either place, but she looked at them as she passed, acknowledged them the way you acknowledged things that had happened in your life. Not as wounds to be carried, but as territory you had moved through and knew now. She parked outside the residence and sat in the car for a moment. The woman who had stood in that bridal suite 6 weeks ago was still inside her. She hadn't gone anywhere. The pearl earrings were in a drawer upstairs, and the wedding dress was still on the back of the closet door because she still hadn't decided what to do with it, and the wound of that morning was still real. Would be real for a long time. Would require the kind of slow, patient work that wounds required when you didn't rush them toward resolution before they were ready. But she was not that woman only. She was also the woman who had walked out of Harrington Hall alone and kept moving. who had signed a contract in a fluorescent-lit room at 5 in the morning with a stranger who turned out to be not a stranger, who had sat across from Galloway without anyone behind her and told him the truth without softening it, who had walked into the Meridian building and walked back out with the thing that changed everything, who showed up every Tuesday and Thursday for a 7-year-old boy with watchful eyes and the accurate internal instrument and said, "I'll be here," and was. She got out of the car. She went inside. Adrian was in the kitchen again. He had developed the habit, she had noticed, of being in whatever room she was likely to enter first, which was not something he did obviously or announced, just a quiet orientation, the way some people arrange themselves toward warmth without making a production of it. He looked up when she came in. "How was it?" he said. "Hard," she said. "Real." She set her keys on the counter. "He's going to talk to your lawyer." Something moved in Adrian's face, brief and significant. "He doesn't have to. He wants to." She looked at him. "I think it's the first honest thing he's wanted to do in a long time. I think it's going to cost him a lot, and I think it's going to be the truest thing he's done." She paused. "I'm not forgiving him today, but I'm not closing the door." Adrian nodded. She looked at the garden through the kitchen window. The evening light was low and gold on the trellis, and the new green growth at the tips of the winter roses was visible even in the dimming light, small and tentative and genuinely there, the way things were when they were beginning. "The dress," she said. He looked at her. "The wedding dress. In the closet." She had been thinking about it for days, about what to do with an $800 garment that represented the specific kind of ruin that turned out not to be ruin. "I'm going to donate it. There's an organization that alters donated wedding dresses for women who can't afford them. I found it last week." He was quiet for a moment. "All right." "It's a good dress," she said. "It should be on someone who chose it." He looked at her with the open expression, the fully open one, no management, no distance. And she looked back at him with the same quality of looking. Two people who had stopped performing anything for each other, who were in the specific, ordinary, irreplaceable place of knowing each other. "Dinner," he said. "Yes," she said. She picked up the coffee she'd left that morning. Cold, she poured it out, and she filled the kettle and set it on the stove, and outside the kitchen window, the last of the evening gold moved across the winter roses, touching the new green at the tips of the bare branches, the first small proof that the cold season had an end to it, that things that had been stripped back to their essential structure were still alive, still building toward something, still, despite everything, growing.